They called him the Butcher of Ravenspire behind gilded doors and trembling lips, but not a single lord who whispered that name ever dared repeat it twice. Duke Cadric Blackthorne had buried 3 assassination attempts before his 30th winter, each time returning the conspirators' severed house crests to their widows wrapped in black silk. Tonight, standing over the body of a man who had called him unfit to rule, Cadric felt nothing, and that emptiness was the most honest thing left inside him. What follows is the architecture of how one man's refusal to break became the most dangerous force an aristocracy had ever failed to destroy. Stay until the last word falls. You will understand why. The blood had not yet dried on the council chamber floor when Cadric Blackthorne ordered the windows opened. Cold mountain air knifed through the room, scattering parchment from the oak table and guttering the candelabras that lined the stone walls. 3 council members remained seated. None moved. None breathed loudly enough to draw attention. The dead man on the floor had been Lord Percival Ashwick, master of Ravenspire's southern treasury, a bloated politician who had spent 14 months siphoning gold into accounts belonging to rival noble houses. The evidence had arrived that morning, sealed with wax from Ashwick's own signet ring, a careless, arrogant mistake from a man who believed wealth made him untouchable. Cadric stood at the head of the table with his hands flat against the surface, knuckles white, the ceremonial dagger still embedded in the wood where he had driven it after pulling it from Ashwick's throat. His coat was immaculate. Not a single drop of blood had reached the fabric. That precision was not accidental. Men who ruled through violence understood that appearance was its own kind of weaponry. "Someone remove him," Cadric said without looking down. His voice carried no emotion. It never did. Emotion was a currency he refused to spend in public. 2 guards dragged the body toward the service corridor. A thin trail of crimson smeared across centuries-old stone. The remaining council members, who are Lord Darius Vane, Lady Margot Selborne, and the aged Chancellor Ormond Hale, watched the Duke the way animals watched a predator who had just finished feeding and might still be hungry. Cadric pulled the dagger free from the oak, wiped the blade on a linen cloth, set it beside the map of Ravenspire that dominated the table's center. "The Treasury audit will conclude by morning," he said. "Every account Ashwick touched gets frozen. Every name connected to his ledgers gets brought to me personally. Not to the court, not to the magistrate. To me." Chancellor Hale cleared his throat with the caution of a man navigating a conversation that could become his obituary. "Your Grace, Lord Ashwick had allies, powerful ones. His family controls 3 trade routes through the southern pass. Killing him openly was efficient." Cadric's gaze landed on the old man like the flat side of a blade. "You want me to apologize for solving a problem that your diplomacy failed to address for over a year? I want you to consider the consequences." "I always consider the consequences, Chancellor. That is the difference between ruling and performing." Cadric straightened his cuffs. "Ashwick stole from this province. He funded enemies who want to see Blackthorne banners burning from the northern watchtowers. The consequence of mercy would have been civil insurrection within 6 months. The consequence of what I did tonight is fear, and fear, unlike loyalty, does not require maintenance." The room swallowed that statement in suffocating silence. Lady Margot Selborne, the only woman who had survived 2 decades on Ravenspire's council, spoke from behind a goblet of untouched wine. "The southern families will demand an answer. Then they will receive one." Cadric turned toward the window where the mountain wind still poured into the chamber. Below the fortress, Ravenspire stretched across frozen valleys and jagged ridgelines, a province carved from stone and governed by blood since the first Blackthorne lord planted his war banner on these cliffs 4 centuries ago. "Tell them Duke Blackthorne sends his regards. If they want Ashwick's body returned, they can collect it from the eastern gate. I will not waste horses on a delivery." He left the council chamber without dismissing anyone. That was deliberate too. Leaving men seated in silence after violence forced them to sit with their own cowardice. It was a lesson his father had taught him at 12 years old, the night the old Duke had executed a traitor in the banquet hall and then returned to finish his meal while the body cooled 10 feet from the table. You do not flinch, you do not explain, you act, and you let the silence afterward do the rest. Cadric climbed the eastern stairwell alone. No guards. He had dismissed his personal escort 3 years ago after discovering that 2 of the 4 men assigned to protect him had been paid to report his movements to House Meyercourt. He replaced them with nothing. A duke who needed bodyguards inside his own castle was a duke who had already lost control. The private quarters at the top of the eastern tower were austere in a way that disturbed visiting diplomats. No tapestries, no gilded mirrors, a writing desk, a weapons rack, a bed fitted with dark wool blankets rather than silk. The only concession to status was the massive window that overlooked the northern cliffs, where storms rolled in from the mountains with the regularity of seasons and the violence of artillery. Cedric poured whiskey from a crystal decanter that had belonged to his grandfather, drank it standing. The warmth hit the hollow space beneath his ribs where something like exhaustion had lived for so long it no longer registered as abnormal. He was 32 years old. He had been Duke of Ravenspire since 23, when his father's heart had stopped during a border negotiation, and the old man had fallen face first into a plate of roasted pheasant. No ceremony, no warning. One moment the most feared man in the northern provinces existed, and the next he was meat going cold on a dining table. Cedric inherited a kingdom held together by his father's reputation and a network of alliances so fragile that 3 houses attempted a coup within the first month of his succession. He crushed them all, publicly, methodically, without hesitation and without mercy, because mercy would have signaled that the new duke was softer than his predecessor. He was not softer, he was worse, and every lord in Ravenspire knew it. The knock came after midnight. 3 sharp raps, the cadence of his steward, Hadrian Coles, the only man alive who Cedric permitted to interrupt his solitude after dark. Enter. Hadrian stepped inside and closed the door with practiced quietness. He was a lean man in his late 40s, silver threading through dark hair, with the precise movements of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating powerful men's tempers. He had served Cedric's father before serving Cedric. That continuity made him invaluable, and, in the darkest corners of Cedric's mind, vaguely suspect. Loyalty inherited was not loyalty earned. The message arrived from Thornhaven, Hadrian said. He placed a sealed letter on the writing desk. Lord Aldrich Vale has accepted the terms. Cedric did not reach for the letter immediately. He studied Hadrian's expression instead. The careful neutrality, the controlled stillness around the eyes. His steward was hiding something, not information, reaction. You disapprove, Cedric said. It is not my place to approve or disapprove. That has never stopped you before. Hadrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. An arranged marriage to consolidate the Vale alliance is sound strategy. Lord Vale controls the eastern waterways and half the grain supply to 3 provinces. Binding his house to Blackthorn eliminates a potential adversary and secures resources we will need if the southern families retaliate for Ashwick. You are listing reasons to support the decision while your face argues against it. Hadrian exhaled through his nose. Lady Seraphina Vale is not a woman who will disappear quietly into the role of Duchess. I do not need her to disappear quietly. I need her family's grain shipments and river access. She has a reputation, Your Grace. Everyone has a reputation. Most of them are constructed by enemies or fools. Hers was constructed by herself. Hadrian stepped closer to the desk, lowering his voice as though the walls might report to someone. She publicly humiliated Lord Calloway at the Thornhaven Assembly last spring, accused him of falsifying crop reports to inflate taxation. She produced documentation, actual ledgers. Calloway lost his seat on the Eastern Council within a week. Cedric said nothing. He turned the whiskey glass slowly between his fingers. She is intelligent, politically aggressive, and entirely unwilling to be decorative, Hadrian continued. Bringing her into Blackthorn Keep will not be like acquiring a chess piece. It will be like introducing a second player to the board. For the first time in hours, something shifted behind Cedric's expression. Not amusement. He had forgotten what amusement felt like years ago. But interest. The cold, analytical interest of a man who spent his life surrounded by predictable cowards and suddenly heard the description of something unpredictable. Good, he said. I am tired of playing alone. He unsealed the letter. The terms were straightforward. Lord Aldrich Vale would deliver his eldest daughter to Blackthorn Keep within the fortnight. In exchange, Blackthorn forces would guarantee protection of Vale's eastern territories against border raids and the trade embargo imposed by House Meyercourt. The marriage would formalize the alliance. Seraphina Vale would become Duchess of Ravenspire. The Vale bloodline would merge with Blackthorn authority. On parchment, it was clean, strategic. Two powerful families uniting against common threats. In reality, it was a transaction built on mutual desperation disguised as strength. Vale needed Blackthorn's military. Blackthorn needed Vale's resources. And between those needs, a woman was being shipped across provincial lines like cargo with a heartbeat. Cadric folded the letter and placed it in the desk drawer beside a loaded pistol and a vial of the antidote he kept for the three most common aristocratic poisons. Survival was never elegant. The fortnight passed with the mechanical efficiency Cadric demanded of everything within his domain. He ordered the western wing of the keep prepared, furnished but not lavishly, because excess signaled a desire to impress, and he would not give his future wife the satisfaction of believing he cared about her comfort. He reviewed the security arrangements personally, new locks on interior passages, additional sentries at corridor intersections, not to protect her, to monitor her. Trust was earned through years of proven reliability and tested under conditions designed to reveal disloyalty. It was never gifted on the basis of a signature on a marriage contract. The day Seraphina Vale arrived, Ravenspire was drowning beneath iron-gray clouds that pressed against the mountains like a bruise spreading across skin. Wind screamed through the fortress corridors. The courtyard flag snapped with the violence of cannon fire. Cadric watched from the highest window of the eastern tower as the Vale carriage rolled through the main gate, escorted by 40 mounted soldiers in silver and green livery. He noted the formation. Professional. Disciplined. Lord Vale had not sent his daughter with a ceremonial escort. He had sent her with a military detachment capable of fighting its way back out if negotiations collapsed. Smart man, foolish enough to let his daughter go, but smart enough to plan for betrayal. Hadrian appeared in the doorway. The Lady Vale's carriage has entered the courtyard. Shall I arrange the formal reception in the great hall? No. Hadrian paused. Your Grace? I will meet her in the council chamber, alone. Protocol suggests I parade her through a hall of nobles who will spend the entire ceremony measuring whether she is beautiful enough to justify the alliance and weak enough to control. I will not give them that performance. Cadric turned from the window. Bring her to me. Dismiss her escort to the guest barracks. And Hadrian, make sure she walks the eastern corridor. The eastern corridor was the longest route to the council chamber. It passed through the gallery of executed traitors, a hallway lined with portraits of men and women who had betrayed House Blackthorn over 4 centuries, each painting slashed through the face with a single diagonal cut from a blade. It was theatrical. Cadric knew that, but theater served a purpose when the audience needed to understand what kind of stage they had stepped onto. 20 minutes later, the council chamber doors opened. Seraphina Vale entered the room the way a knife enters skin, without announcement and with immediate consequence. She was not what the portraits and gossip had prepared him for. Taller than expected, sharper in the jaw and cheekbones, eyes the color of wet iron, carrying an intelligence that scanned the room with the efficiency of someone cataloging exits, weapons, and the distance between herself and the nearest threat. Her traveling clothes were practical, dark wool, riding boots, no jewelry except a thin silver chain at her throat that could have been sentimental or could have been nothing at all. She did not curtsy. Cadric filed that detail alongside everything else. Lady Vale. Duke Blackthorn. Her voice was low and unhurried, with the kind of measured calm that came from years of speaking in rooms full of men who did not want to listen. Your hallway is dramatic. I counted 11 portraits. Were there actually 11 traitors, or did you commission extras for atmosphere? The silence that followed was not hostile. It was evaluative. 2 predators in the same territory establishing whose teeth were sharper. 14, Cadric said. 3 were removed after their families paid considerable sums for the privilege. I allowed it because the revenue was more useful than the reminder. So even your threats have a price. Everything has a price, Lady Vale. The question is whether you understand what yours cost your father. Her expression did not change, but something hardened beneath the surface, a fracture line appearing in stone that had been under pressure for a long time. My father made a strategic decision. I am here because Blackthorn needs Vale resources, and Vale needs Blackthorn steel. There is no mystery in that equation. No, Kydrick agreed, but there is a question. He stepped closer, not aggressively, with the deliberate, slow movement of a man who understood that physical proximity was its own form of negotiation. Can you survive here? Serafina held his gaze without retreating. I survived Thornhaven. I survived Lord Calloway's retaliation after I destroyed his political career. I survived my own father using me as currency. The iron in her eyes sharpened to something that could draw blood. I think I can manage your castle, Your Grace. Kydrick studied her for a long moment. Behind the defiance, he recognized something he had not expected to see in another human being. The particular kind of damage that came from being valuable enough to use, but never valuable enough to protect. He knew that architecture intimately. It was the blueprint of his own survival. He stepped back, gestured toward the chair at the opposite end of the council table. Sit. We need to discuss terms that your father's letter did not include. Serafina sat with the posture of someone who had been trained to occupy space without apology. She folded her hands on the table in a way that was simultaneously composed and subtly confrontational, claiming territory on a surface that belonged to the most dangerous man in the province. The marriage is a political instrument, Kydrick began, standing rather than sitting, because the height advantage served his purpose. You will have the title of Duchess. You will attend council sessions. You will be seen at public functions as evidence that House Vale and House Blackthorn are united. And behind closed doors? Behind closed doors, you will have access to the Western Wing, the library, and the private gardens. You will not enter the Eastern Tower without permission. You will not communicate with your father's house without copies of every letter delivered to my desk first. And you will not form independent alliances with any member of my court. Serafina's expression remained neutral, but her fingers pressed harder against each other. You are describing a prison with better furniture. I am describing reality. You are entering a fortress surrounded by enemies who will use you as a weapon against me the moment they find leverage. Every conversation you have, every friendship you form, every favor you accept becomes ammunition in someone else's war. I'm not restricting you out of cruelty. I'm restricting you because the last person I trusted without conditions ended up funding an army that tried to breach these walls. And you believe I might do the same. I believe everyone might do the same. That is why I am still alive. The wind howled against the windows. Somewhere below, soldiers shouted orders in the courtyard. The world outside continued its violent machinery while two people sat inside a room deciding the terms of a coexistence that neither had chosen. Serafina leaned back in her chair. I will agree to your conditions on one amendment. Kydrick raised an eyebrow. Nobody amended his conditions. That was the entire point of conditions. I want access to the Treasury reports, not the public summaries your Chancellor distributes to the court, the actual ledgers. If I am going to be Duchess of Ravenspire, I intend to understand where the money flows because money is the only language that tells the truth about power. The request caught him off guard. He did not show it. Showing surprise was a tactical failure he had eliminated from his behavioral vocabulary years ago. But internally, the calculation shifted. This was not the request of a woman angling for jewelry budgets or household allowances. This was the request of someone who understood that economic intelligence was the foundation of political survival. Why? Because your Lord Ashwick stole from you for 14 months, and your council failed to catch it. If your treasury had a second pair of eyes, unfamiliar eyes without existing loyalties to any faction, you might have caught the discrepancy sooner. Kydrick felt the dangerous pull of something he had not experienced in years. Respect. Not the manufactured deference of nobles afraid for their lives. The genuine involuntary recognition that another human being's mind operated on the same frequency as his own. He should have refused. Granting access to financial intelligence created vulnerability. Every instinct forged by 9 years of isolated rule screamed against it. Approved, he said, with one condition of my own. You report findings directly to me. Not to the Chancellor, not to anyone. If I learn that treasury information reached any ear other than mine through your access, the arrangement ends. And in Ravenspire, arrangements do not end with polite conversation. Understood. They regarded each other across the table. Two people who had been shaped by different forms of institutional violence arriving at the same conclusion, that the most dangerous thing in any kingdom was not the enemy at the gates, but the ally whose loyalty had never been tested. The marriage ceremony took place 3 days later in the Great Hall of Blackthorn Keep with the mechanical precision of a military operation. No warmth, no sentiment. Nobles stood in rigid rows wearing expressions calibrated to conceal everything they actually felt about the union. Lord Darius Vane watched from the front row with an unreadable face. Lady Margot Selborne observed with the patient attention of someone recording details for future use. Chancellor Hale performed the civil binding with the efficiency of a man signing an arms contract. Kedrick spoke the required words with the same intonation he used to issue wartime directives. Serafina repeated her portion with the composure of someone who understood that this ceremony was performance, not commitment, a public transaction dressed in tradition. When it was over, Kedrick did not kiss his new wife. He offered his arm, escorted her from the hall, and returned to the council chamber alone before the banquet wines had finished being poured. The first weeks were territorial mapping disguised as domestic routine. Serafina navigated Blackthorn Keep with the systematic precision of a cartographer, learning the corridors, identifying the servants who reported to the steward, noting which guards changed shifts at irregular intervals. She ate meals in the Great Hall but spoke sparingly, watching the political currents flow between noble families the way an engineer studies the pressure points in a dam before calculating where it will break. Kedrick monitored her through his own network. Hadrian delivered daily reports, who she spoke with, which sections of the library she visited, what questions she asked the household staff. The reports were remarkable in their ordinariness. She was doing exactly what she had described, learning the machinery of the keep. She had not attempted to contact her father. She had not formed visible alliances with any courtier. She had not done anything that could be interpreted as subversion. That made Kedrick more suspicious, not less. Clean behavior in a dirty environment meant either genuine integrity or exceptional tradecraft. Both were dangerous in different ways. Their first real confrontation erupted during a council meeting 12 days after the wedding. Chancellor Hale presented a proposal to increase taxation on the eastern farming villages to fund the military buildup along the southern border. The numbers were dry, the justification sound, and every council member nodded with the reflexive agreement of men who understood that opposing the Duke's military priorities was professionally fatal. Serafina spoke before Kedrick could approve the measure. The eastern villages are already at subsistence-level yield after last winter's frost damage. Increasing taxation by 12% will push 3 settlements past economic viability. You will collect more gold in the short term and lose the agricultural base that feeds your southern garrisons within 2 seasons. The council chamber went still. Lord Darius Vane looked at Serafina as though she had drawn a weapon in a sanctuary. Chancellor Hale turned to Kedrick with an expression that asked permission to dismiss the interruption without the indignity of acknowledging it. Kedrick said nothing. He watched Serafina instead. "You reviewed the agricultural reports," he said. "I reviewed the treasury ledgers. The agricultural data was buried in the expenditure margins where your chancellor apparently does not look." She turned toward Hale without hostility, but without deference either. "The frost damage reduced eastern crop yield by 31%. Your projected tax revenue assumes normal production levels. The math does not work." Hale's face reddened. "The Duchess is unfamiliar with the complexity of provincial fiscal." "The Duchess is familiar with the difference between a functioning spreadsheet and a fantasy," Serafina said. "Your projections assume yields that do not exist. If the Duke approves this measure, you will bankrupt villages that supply 40% of the garrison grain, and within 18 months, you will be importing food from the same southern provinces you are currently arming against." Silence. Absolute crystalline silence in which every noble at the table understood that something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of Blackthorn Keep's power structure. Kedrick leaned back in his chair. The dangerous interest he had felt during their first meeting returned with sharper edges. "Chancellor, verify her numbers by tomorrow." Hale opened his mouth. That was not a request. The meeting ended without the taxation proposal being approved. As the council members filed out, Kedrick remained seated, watching Seraphina gather the ledgers she had brought with her. Actual documents, not the decorative attendance most duchesses performed at council sessions. "You made an enemy of Hale," he said when they were alone. "Hale was already incompetent. I simply made it visible." Visible incompetence embarrasses powerful men. Embarrassed, powerful men become vindictive. Is that a warning? It is an observation. Kedrick stood. Walked to where she stood with the ledgers pressed against her chest like armor. He stopped closer than protocol permitted. Close enough that she could see the network of fine scars along his jaw where assassination attempts had left permanent evidence. "You were right about the numbers," he said quietly. "The projection was flawed. If I had approved it, 3 villages would have collapsed within a year." Seraphina met his gaze without flinching. "Then it is fortunate I was paying attention." "It is inconvenient that you were paying attention. Fortunate and inconvenient are not the same thing." The complexity of that statement hung between them like a blade balanced on its point. He was telling her, in his own compressed language, that her intelligence was simultaneously the most valuable and the most threatening thing she had brought into his fortress. She understood. He saw the understanding cross her face. Not fear, not gratitude, but the precise calculation of someone recalibrating their survival strategy based on new information. "I should retire to the Western Wing," she said. "You should." He did not move from her path. 5 seconds passed. The candlelight threw their shadows against the stone walls in patterns that looked like 2 figures locked in combat or embrace. The distinction between the two was never clean in places like Blackthorn Keep. Kedrick stepped aside. Seraphina left without looking back. That night, Kedrick stood at the window of the eastern tower and watched the stormfront building over the mountains. Lightning cracked across the horizon in skeletal branches of white fire. The wind carried the smell of iron and frozen earth, the scent of Ravenspire in winter, which was the scent of endurance stripped of everything decorative. He thought about the look in her eyes when she had challenged the Chancellor. Not the words. The words were sharp but unremarkable. The look. Behind the analytical precision, he had seen something raw, something personal. She was not simply correcting fiscal errors. She was proving, to the room and to herself, that she would not be invisible. That the transaction which had delivered her to this fortress like diplomatic cargo would not define the limits of what she was allowed to be. He recognized that compulsion. It lived inside his own chest, buried beneath the layers of control and brutality. The furious, private refusal to become what other people had decided he should be. His father had wanted a weapon. The council wanted a figurehead. The aristocracy wanted a tyrant predictable enough to manage. He had become something none of them designed, something they could not categorize and therefore could not control. And now a woman with iron eyes and sharper ledger analysis than his chancellor was occupying the western wing of his fortress, and for the first time in 9 years, the architecture of his solitude felt less like a fortress and more like a cage. Kedrick poured another whiskey, drank it slow. Let the burn replace the thought. Dangerous. She was dangerous, not because she might betray him, everyone might betray him, but because she might matter. And in Ravenspire, the things that mattered were the things that enemies learned to aim for. 3 floors below, in the shadows of the service corridor that connected the kitchens to the steward's quarters, Hadrian Coles stood in the darkness holding a sealed letter he had not included in his daily report to the Duke. The wax seal bore no crest, just a pressed thumbprint in dark crimson. He broke the seal. Read the contents by the light of a single candle. His face did not change, but his hands trembled. He folded the letter, placed it inside his coat, and walked deeper into the darkness of Blackthorn Keep, carrying a secret that could burn the entire dynasty to its foundations. Hadrian Coles had served House Blackthorn for 26 years, without once questioning whether loyalty and survival could exist inside the same body. Tonight, standing in the service corridor with a letter that smelled faintly of lye and foreign ink, he discovered the answer. They could not. One of them had to die so the other could keep breathing, and the choice had already been made for him by people who understood that the most effective weapon inside any fortress was not a blade or a vial of poison, but a man who had access to every locked door. He burned the letter over the kitchen candle, watched the parchment curl into black nothing. The instructions were already memorized. 3 sentences that carried enough weight to collapse a dynasty. He would execute them when the time came. Not because he wanted to, because the alternative was a grave in the northern marshes where even the ravens would not find his bones. Above him, the fortress groaned under the weight of the storm. Morning arrived in Ravenspire the way it always did during the cold months. Reluctantly, with pale light that looked bruised before it touched the ground. Frost coated the courtyard stones. Soldiers moved through pre-dawn exercises with the grim efficiency of men who understood that discipline was not optional in a province where the weather killed faster than the politics. Serafina was awake before the household staff delivered breakfast. She had been awake for hours. Sleep in an unfamiliar fortress required a specific kind of trust she had not yet manufactured, and the walls of the western wing carried sounds differently than Thornhaven. Distant footsteps, the metallic rhythm of patrols changing, the occasional shout from the lower barracks that could have been training or could have been something worse. She sat at the writing desk in her chamber reviewing the treasury ledgers she had copied by hand the previous evening. Chancellor Hale's accounting was not merely incompetent, it was architecturally flawed in ways that suggested either profound laziness or deliberate obfuscation. Revenue from the northern mining operations was recorded in aggregate totals rather than itemized by individual mines. Expenditure reports listed categories so broad that an entire military campaign could have been buried inside the line item for provincial maintenance. It was the kind of financial structure that rewarded people who wanted to steal and punished people who wanted to understand. A knock at the door. Not Hadrian's cadence. Softer, tentative. "Enter." A young woman in servant's dress stepped inside, carrying a breakfast tray. She was perhaps 19, with the careful posture of someone who had been trained to be invisible. Her eyes swept across the room. The ledgers spread across the desk, the untouched bed. And Serafina caught the micro-expression of someone cataloging details for a report she would deliver later. "Set it on the table by the window," Serafina said. Then, as the girl turned to leave, "What is your name?" The servant froze. The question was unexpected. Duchesses in Ravenspire did not ask servants their names. They barely acknowledged servants existed. "Elara, my lady." "Who do you report to, Elara?" The girl's face went white. The panic was immediate and total, the reaction of someone whose cover had been stripped away by a question she had not been prepared to answer. "I serve the household, my lady. Under the head steward's fa." "I did not ask who you serve. I asked who you report to. There is a difference, and we both know it." Silence. Elara's hands trembled against the empty tray. The terror in her eyes was genuine. Not the manufactured nervousness of a trained spy, but the raw fear of a young woman caught between 2 powerful forces, and realizing that neither one would protect her. "The steward, my lady. Master Coles." "Thank you, Elara. You can go." The girl fled. Serafina returned to the ledgers, but her focus had shifted. Hadrian Coles was monitoring her through household staff. That was expected. Any competent steward would maintain surveillance on a new arrival in the Duke's residence. The interesting question was not whether she was being watched, but what Hadrian intended to do with the information he collected. She had been inside Blackthorn Keep for 16 days. In that time, she had identified 14 members of Hadrian's informal intelligence network embedded within the household staff, mapped the patrol schedules for both the interior guard and the exterior garrison, and established the precise routine by which the Duke moved through the fortress between his private quarters, the council chamber, the training yards, and the eastern tower where he spent his evenings alone drinking whiskey in the dark. She had also identified something that troubled her more than any of those tactical details. Something she could not yet articulate clearly, but felt in the way a navigator feels a current shifting beneath the surface of water that appears calm. Hadrian Coles was afraid of someone, and it was not the Duke. The council met at midday. 6 seats occupied around the great table. Cedric at the head, wearing his authority the way other men wore armor. Visible, deliberate, and designed to make approach feel like confrontation. Chancellor Hale to his right, still radiating the slow-burning resentment of a man who had been publicly corrected by a woman 12 days ago, and had spent every night since rehearsing comebacks he would never have the nerve to deliver. Lord Darius Vane across the table, watchful and quiet, his political instincts tuned to frequencies other people could not hear. Lady Margot Selborne at the far end, her expression a masterwork of aristocratic neutrality. And Seraphina seated in the chair that had been empty for 9 years, the Duchess's seat, positioned at Caedric's left, close enough to counsel and far enough to be dismissed. The agenda was border security. Reports from the southern watchtowers indicated increased movement among House Meyercourt's military forces, troop formation shifting from defensive positions along the river to forward staging areas within a day's march of Blackthorn territory. "They are testing our perimeter," Lord Vane said, flattening a scout report against the table. "Small patrols, probing formations. Nothing that constitutes an act of war, but the positioning is aggressive." "Lord Meyercourt is measuring response time," Caedric said. "He wants to know how quickly we can mobilize southern defenses and whether the garrison strength matches what our intelligence reports claim." "Our intelligence reports claim 5,000 men at the southern line. The actual number is closer to 3,800. Vane's voice carried no inflection, but the admission landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. "We have been operating at reduced strength since the Ashwick defection. 2 companies of his private guard deserted rather than face conscription into Blackthorn forces." "Deserted," Caedric repeated. The word sounded different in his mouth, thinner, more dangerous. "Deserted or relocated?" Vane hesitated. That hesitation contained the answer. "They crossed into Meyercourt territory 8 days ago. Our scouts tracked them to a staging camp 15 miles south of the border." The temperature in the room dropped. Not physically. The hearth still burned. The candles still threw warm light across the stone walls. But the atmospheric pressure changed the way it changes before a lightning strike, when the air itself becomes charged with the possibility of catastrophic discharge. Caedric pressed his knuckles against the table's surface. The gesture was subtle. A redistribution of weight that signaled his body processing information his face refused to betray. Seraphina noticed it. She noticed everything. "Ashwick's private guard did not desert," Caedric said quietly. "They were extracted. Meyercourt arranged their defection before Ashwick died, which means Meyercourt knew I would kill Ashwick before I knew it myself." The implication settled over the council like a burial shroud. Someone inside Blackthorn Keep was feeding intelligence to House Meyercourt. "That is speculation," Chancellor Hale said, though his voice cracked on the second word in a way that undermined the entire sentence. "It is arithmetic," Caedric said. "Meyercourt positioned extraction teams before the assassination. Extraction requires advanced knowledge. Advanced knowledge requires a source inside these walls." His eyes moved slowly around the table, landing on each face with the weight of a gun barrel swinging across a firing line. "One of you, or someone who answers to one of you." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The fireplace crackled. Outside, wind hammered the fortress walls with the relentless percussion of a siege that had not yet officially begun. Seraphina broke the silence. "How many people knew about the Ashwick investigation before the execution?" Caedric's gaze shifted to her. For a fraction of a second, something passed between them. Not warmth, not alliance, but the mutual recognition of 2 minds arriving at the same strategic question simultaneously. "The investigation was not widely known," he said. "I conducted it personally. But the evidence was delivered to you. Someone collected Ashwick's financial records. Someone compiled the documentation. Someone sealed it and brought it to your desk." Seraphina leaned forward. "Who handled the physical evidence?" Silence. A different kind of silence now. Not the stunned paralysis of the previous moment, but the sharp, pressurized quiet of people realizing that the question had just identified the leak's most likely source with surgical precision. Hadrian Coles had assembled the Ashwick evidence. Caedric did not look at the empty chair where his steward would normally sit. Hadrian was not present at council meetings. He attended by invitation only, when administrative matters required his input, but his absence now felt deliberate, as though the conversation had been anticipated and avoided. "We will discuss the border response after I have reviewed the full intelligence assessment," Caedric said, closing the discussion with a tone that permitted no further commentary. Dismissed. The council members filed out with the controlled haste of people leaving a room where the air had become too thin to breathe comfortably. Lady Margot lingered for half a beat, her eyes finding Seraphina's with an expression that might have been respect or might have been warning. Then she was gone. Cadric remained seated. Seraphina remained seated. "You are thinking about Hadrian," she said. "I am always thinking about Hadrian." Cadric's voice was flat, stripped of inflection, the way a blade is stripped of ornamentation before combat. "He has served this house since before I inherited it. He knew my father. He knows every corridor, every passage, every lock code in this fortress." That is either the argument for trusting him or the argument for suspecting him. It cannot be both. In Ravenspire, it is always both. Cadric stood, walked to the window. The valley below was choked with fog that rolled between the mountain ridges like smoke from a fire no one could locate. Somewhere beneath that fog, 5,000 soldiers, or 3,800, or whatever number was real versus whatever number had been fabricated for comfort, stood between his kingdom and a rival house that apparently had better intelligence than he did. He had built his rule on the principle that absolute control eliminated vulnerability. Control the information, control the access, control the personnel, control the relationships. If everything passed through a single point of authority, nothing could move without detection. But single points of authority required single points of trust, and single points of trust were single points of failure. "If Hadrian is compromised," Seraphina said from behind him, "then everything he has delivered to you for the last 26 years is suspect. Every report, every piece of intelligence, every recommendation." "I am aware." "Are you also aware that he has been monitoring me through 7 household servants since the day I arrived? That he receives daily reports on my movements, my reading, my conversations, and the contents of my correspondence desk?" Cadric turned from the window. "You identified them." "I identified 14. There may be more." Something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. Not anger, recognition. The woman he had married as a political transaction was running counter-surveillance operations inside his own fortress with an efficiency that rivaled his steward's network. "You could have told me this earlier." "I could have, but I wanted to understand what Hadrian was doing with the information first. A loyal steward monitors a new arrival to protect the Duke. A compromised steward monitors a new arrival to identify threats to his own operation." She paused. "His reports on me have been accurate but selective. He records what I do. He does not record what he does." Cadric crossed the room, stopped 3 feet from her chair, close enough that the candlelight showed the tension in his jaw, the constant grinding pressure of a man whose entire existence depended on controlling everything around him while the foundations shifted beneath his feet. "You have been here 16 days, and you have already identified a potential security breach that my own intelligence apparatus missed. Your intelligence apparatus is Hadrian. That is the problem. What do you suggest?" The question landed between them with weight neither of them expected. Cadric did not ask for suggestions. He issued directives. He made decisions in isolation and distributed them as finished products. Asking for input was an act so foreign to his operating structure that the words felt like a different language leaving his mouth. Seraphina recognized the significance. He could see it in the way her breathing changed, a slight deepening, the involuntary physiological response of someone who understood that the ground rules of a relationship had just shifted without either party formally agreeing to the revision. "Do not confront him," she said. "If Hadrian is compromised, confrontation gives Meyercourt time to activate whatever secondary assets are in place. You remove the tool, but the hand that used it remains intact. Then what? Feed him. Give him information you want Meyercourt to receive. Control the flow by controlling the source. If Hadrian is loyal, nothing happens. If he is not, Meyercourt acts on intelligence you have designed, and the response tells you exactly what their operational capacity looks like." Cadric stared at her. The firelight carved shadows across his face that made him look less like a duke and more like something older, something carved from the same black stone as the fortress itself. "You are describing a counterintelligence operation. I am describing survival. Those are the same thing in this castle." "Yes, they are." The distance between them was 3 feet of candlelit air, but the space felt compressed, charged with the gravitational pull of 2 people who operated on the same frequency, discovering that shared wavelengths created resonance and resonance created vulnerability. Kadric stepped back. The withdrawal was controlled but not smooth, a fractional hesitation in his movement that betrayed the effort required to reestablish distance. "I will consider your proposal," he said. "You already accepted it. You would not have asked for my suggestion if you intended to discard it." The corner of his mouth did something that was not quite a smile. It lasted less than a second before the mask reassembled. But it happened, and Seraphina saw it, and they both knew she saw it. He left the council chamber. 4 days later, Kadric implemented the counterintelligence operation without informing Seraphina that he had accepted her strategy in full. He fed Hadrian a fabricated military assessment indicating that Blackthorn forces were redeploying 300 cavalry units from the southern border to reinforce the eastern trade routes. A plausible but strategically meaningless movement that would, if transmitted to Meyercourt, provoke a specific and identifiable response along the southern frontier. The false intelligence was delivered during a routine evening briefing. Kadric watched Hadrian's hands as the steward received the document. Steady, professional, no tremor. Either the man was innocent, or he had spent 26 years perfecting the art of stillness under pressure. Both possibilities were terrifying. While the trap waited to spring, the dangerous architecture of Kadric and Seraphina's relationship continued to evolve in ways that neither could control and both refused to name. He found her in the library at odd hours, always the financial records, always the maps, always the infrastructure documents that revealed how Ravenspire actually functioned beneath the ceremonial surface. She had reorganized the treasury classification system without permission, creating a secondary ledger that cross-referenced income sources against expenditure categories with a precision that made Hale's original system look like a child's drawing. "You are exceeding the boundaries of our agreement," Kadric said one night, finding her surrounded by candlelight and parchment at a table that groaned under the weight of provincial records. "Our agreement gave me access to treasury reports. I'm simply reading them more carefully than your chancellor did. Now you restructured the entire classification methodology. Because the existing methodology was designed to hide information, not organize it. I made it functional. You should be grateful." "I am not grateful. I am concerned that you are building an independent knowledge base inside my own fortress." Seraphina set down her pen, looked at him with the steady intensity that he had started to anticipate the way a man anticipates the moment before a storm breaks, knowing it would arrive, unable to prevent it, and privately unwilling to shelter from it. "If I wanted to undermine you, I would not do it by improving your financial intelligence. I would do it by leaving your chancellor's incompetence intact and watching you drown in data you could not interpret. The fact that I am making your systems better should tell you something about my intentions. It tells me you are either genuinely invested in the stability of this province or exceptionally patient in constructing a long-term sabotage strategy. And which do you believe?" Kadric did not answer immediately. He pulled a chair from the table and sat across from her, an act so unprecedented that it registered in the room like a physical event. Duke Blackthorn did not sit at other people's tables. He summoned people to his. "I believe you are the most dangerous person in this castle," he said, "and I believe that includes me." Seraphina's breath caught, not dramatically, a small interruption in rhythm, barely visible, the kind of involuntary response that could not be manufactured and therefore could not be false. "That might be the closest thing to a compliment you have ever given anyone." "It is not a compliment. It is a threat assessment." "In your vocabulary, those are the same thing." They sat in the library while the fortress settled into its nighttime rhythms around them. Guards changed shifts, fires burned low. The mountain wind pressed against the windows with the patience of something that had been trying to enter for centuries. Kadric found himself studying the way she worked, the efficiency of her pen strokes, the way she organized documents in spatial patterns rather than stacks, the occasional pause where she pressed 2 fingers against her temple in concentration. These were not the observations of a duke monitoring a political asset. These were the observations of a man watching a woman and realizing, with the slow horror of someone who has built their entire existence on the principle of emotional isolation, that the walls were developing cracks. He left the library without speaking, climbed the eastern tower stairs, poured whiskey, stood at the window. The fog had cleared. Below the cliffs, Ravenspire stretched in moonlit silence, fields and forests and fortified villages connected by roads that his ancestors had built with forced labor and maintained with taxation. A kingdom, his kingdom, purchased with blood and held through violence and operated on the fundamental principle that attachment was the enemy of control. Serafina Vale was making that principle impossible to maintain, not through seduction or manipulation or any of the conventional tools that ambitious women deployed in aristocratic courts. Through competence. Through the simple, devastating act of being genuinely useful in a fortress full of sycophants and spies. That was worse. That was so much worse. Because you could resist a woman who wanted your power. You could not resist a woman who made your power more effective. The trap sprung on the 7th day. Scout reports arrived at dawn confirming that Meyercourt forces had shifted their southern positioning in direct response to the fabricated cavalry redeployment. 2 companies of infantry had moved to exploit the supposed gap in Blackthorn's southern line, a gap that did not exist because the cavalry movement had never actually occurred. The false intelligence had reached Meyercourt. Hadrian Coles was the leak. Kedrick read the scout report standing in the eastern tower with morning light cutting across his face like a wound. He read it twice, 3 times. Each reading confirmed what the first had already established, and each confirmation drove the blade deeper into a place he had spent 26 years pretending did not exist. Hadrian had been his father's man. Hadrian had been the steady hand during the chaos of succession. Hadrian had managed the household through 3 assassination attempts, 2 border wars, and the systematic dismantling of every noble family that had challenged Blackthorn authority. Hadrian had been the closest thing to trust that Caedric permitted himself, and Hadrian had been reporting to the enemy. Caedric set the scout report on his desk beside the whiskey decanter and the vial of antidote and the loaded pistol. The geometry of that desk surface contained his entire existence: poison and its cure, violence and its fuel, intelligence and its betrayal. All within arm's reach, all perfectly organized, all utterly insufficient against the specific kind of devastation that came from discovering that the one person you almost trusted had been a weapon aimed at your back for longer than you wanted to calculate. He did not summon Hadrian, not yet. The counterintelligence operation was Phase 1. Identification. Phase 2 required dismantling whatever network Hadrian had built inside the fortress. The secondary contacts, the communication channels, the contingency protocols that any competent agent would have established. Phase 3 was the confrontation itself, and Phase 3 required something Caedric had never needed before. He needed Serafina. Not her intelligence, not her analytical capability, not the treasury expertise or the strategic instincts. He needed her presence in the room when the walls came down, because for the first time in 9 years of solitary rule, the idea of facing a catastrophic betrayal alone felt less like strength and more like a wound he had been calling armor. That realization was the most dangerous thing that had ever entered Blackthorn Keep. More dangerous than the spy in his household, more dangerous than the army massing at his border, more dangerous than the brothers and rivals and assassins who had spent a decade trying to destroy him through conventional violence. Because you could fight an enemy. You could outsmart a traitor. You could crush a rebellion with sufficient military force and political brutality. But you could not fight the slow, catastrophic dissolution of your own isolation without admitting that the isolation had been a prison you built around yourself and called a fortress. And that admission, if it ever came, would change everything about who Caedric Blackthorn was. Below the cliffs, the morning fog was burning away. The sun hit the valley floor in hard white light that revealed every road, every field, every fortification in merciless clarity. Somewhere in that landscape, an enemy army was moving based on false intelligence that proved his steward's treason. Somewhere inside his own walls, the man he almost trusted was carrying secrets that could burn the dynasty to ash. And somewhere in the western wing, a woman with iron eyes was waking up in a fortress that was no longer simply her prison. It was becoming her war. Caedric did not sleep the night after the scout report confirmed Hadrian's treason. He sat in the eastern tower with the loaded pistol on the desk, and the whiskey untouched, and the candle burning to a stub that guttered and died around 3 a.m, leaving him in total darkness with nothing but the sound of wind against stone and the slow, systematic dismantling of everything he had built his survival upon. 26 years. The number kept returning like a blade finding the same wound. 26 years Hadrian Coles had walked these corridors carrying keys to every locked room, holding access codes to every secure passage, managing the household staff who cooked his food, cleaned his chambers, guarded his sleep. 26 years of proximity so intimate that it had become invisible, the way a man stops noticing the walls of his own fortress until those walls start closing inward. He had trusted Hadrian the way lungs trust air, not with affection, not with sentiment, with the blind structural dependence of a system that could not function without the component it had never thought to question. And the component had been compromised. The question that gnawed at him in the darkness was not how long, though that calculation would come, and it would be surgical, and it would strip the last pretense of security from every decision he had made during the years Hadrian's reports had shaped his understanding of the world around him. The question was simpler, more fundamental, more destructive. How much of what he believed about his own kingdom was real? Dawn came. Gray light bled through the tower window. Kedrick stood, washed his face with cold water from the basin, dressed in the same methodical sequence he performed every morning: coat, belt, knife, boots, and descended to the council chamber before the household was fully awake. Serafina was already there. She sat at the great table with a map of Ravenspire spread before her, waited at the corners with brass instruments from the navigation cabinet. Red ink marked positions along the southern border. Meyercourt's troop movements cross-referenced against the false intelligence they had planted through Hadrian. Blue ink traced supply routes. Black ink circled 3 locations inside Blackthorn territory that Serafina had identified as vulnerable to internal sabotage. She looked up when he entered, read his face in a single glance, said nothing about what she saw there: the sleeplessness, the controlled devastation, the particular kind of exhaustion that came not from physical labor, but from the sustained effort of holding yourself together when the structural integrity of your entire existence had been compromised. "The Southern response matches the planted intelligence exactly," she said. Meyercourt moved 2 infantry companies to exploit the supposed cavalry gap within 72 hours of Hadrian receiving the false report. That timeline confirms a direct communication channel. No intermediaries, no dead drops, no encoded correspondence through diplomatic pouches. Hadrian is transmitting directly to someone inside Meyercourt's command structure. How? I traced the courier routes. She turned the map toward him. Your household receives supply deliveries from the village every 3rd day. The delivery wagons return empty, except they do not return empty. I had one of the kitchen workers, a woman named Marin, who despises Hadrian for reasons I did not ask about, watch the loading dock during last night's return run. Hadrian placed a sealed package inside the grain sack storage on the departing wagon. The wagon's route passes through the village and continues south toward the provincial boundary, where it connects with Meyercourt's trade network. Kedrick absorbed this with the stillness of a man being told the precise mechanism by which his own body was being poisoned. Every detail was clinical. Every detail was devastating, and every detail had been uncovered not by his own intelligence apparatus, but by a woman who had been inside his fortress for less than 3 weeks. You have been conducting this investigation without informing me. I informed you that Hadrian was monitoring me through household staff. I informed you that his behavior suggested external compromise. You chose to implement the counterintelligence operation. I chose to continue gathering evidence while the trap was active because waiting for your permission on each step would have created delays that Hadrian would have noticed. You operated independently inside my domain. I operated effectively inside your domain. There's a distinction you should appreciate, given that your own apparatus failed to detect a 26-year security breach. The words landed with the precision of a scalpel-cutting nerve. Kedrick's jaw tightened. The muscles along his neck corded with the physical effort of containing a response that wanted to be fury but could not justify itself as anything other than wounded pride. She was right. That was the worst of it. She was completely, unforgivably right, and the fact that her competence made his vulnerability visible was exactly the kind of threat he had spent his entire life fortifying against. "What else?" he said. The question cost him something. She could see the price of it in the way his hands pressed flat against the table. The same gesture of controlled pressure she had observed during the council meeting when the troop numbers had come up short. Serafina reached beneath the map and withdrew a folded document. I found this in the service corridor adjacent to Hadrian's quarters, hidden inside a false panel behind the water pipes. He was not careless enough to leave evidence in his room. He was careless enough to leave evidence in a corridor he assumed no one else used. She unfolded the document. It was a letter written in a cipher that used a substitution code based on an old provincial trade dialect. Sophisticated enough to defeat casual interception, simple enough that Serafina had broken it in 4 hours using the linguistic patterns she recognized from Eastern merchant contracts in the Treasury archives. The decoded content was 3 paragraphs. Kedrick read them standing. His face did not change. His breathing did not change. Nothing visible changed at all, and that absolute stillness was more frightening than any explosion of rage could have been, because it meant the information was so catastrophic that his body had bypassed emotional response entirely and gone directly to operational processing. The letter confirmed that Hadrian Coles had been in contact with House Meyercourt for approximately 8 years. Not 26, 8. The recruitment had occurred during the border conflict with the western provinces, when Ceadric had sent Hadrian as an intermediary to negotiate supply contracts with neutral trading houses. Meyercourt's intelligence operatives had intercepted him during that mission. The leverage was not ideological, it was personal. Hadrian had a son, a boy Ceadric had never known existed, living under the protection of a Meyercourt vassal family in the Southern Territories. The boy's safety was contingent on Hadrian's continued cooperation. 8 years of intelligence flowing out of Blackthorn Keep. 8 years of military assessments, political strategies, financial data, and personnel reports delivered to the one house that had spent a decade positioning itself to challenge Blackthorn dominance. Every tactical advantage Ceadric believed he held had been observed, recorded, and countered before implementation. He had not been outmaneuvered. He had been transparent. Every decision he made had been watched through the eyes of the man standing closest to him, and the illusion of control he had maintained for nearly a decade was exactly that, an illusion designed by his enemies and performed by the person he trusted most. Ceadric set the letter on the table, placed both hands flat on either side of it, lowered his head until his chin nearly touched his chest. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, the Duke of Ravenspire was not a ruler or a strategist or a weapon forged from political violence. He was a man absorbing the full weight of a betrayal that cut through every layer of armor he had spent his life constructing. Then he raised his head, and the thing that looked out through his eyes was something Serafina had not seen before. Not rage, not calculation, but a cold, clear emptiness that was far more dangerous than either. The look of a man who had just burned his last map and decided to navigate by instinct alone. Where is Hadrian now? In the steward's quarters. His morning routine does not bring him to the main hall until the 7th bell. How long until the 7th bell? 40 minutes. Ceadric straightened, picked up the decoded letter, folded it with mechanical precision, and placed it inside his coat. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat, uninflected tone of a man issuing orders that had already been executed inside his mind and were now simply being transmitted to the physical world for compliance. I need 4 guards I trust absolutely, not men from Hadrian's network, men I selected personally for the garrison rotation. Captain Thorne's unit. They report directly to you through a separate chain of command. You know my military reporting structure. I know everything about this fortress that is written down, and several things that are not. Ceadric looked at her. The emptiness behind his eyes flickered, a momentary fracture in the void where something human still existed, something that recognized that this woman had just handed him the weapon to save his kingdom and was asking for nothing in return except to be allowed to stand in the room where the weapon was used. Come with me, he said. It was not a command. It was not a request. It occupied a space between those categories that had not existed in Ceadric Blackthorn's vocabulary before this moment, the space where a man who had never needed anyone acknowledged that need without surrendering to it. They moved through the fortress together, not side by side, Ceadric slightly ahead, Serafina half a step behind and to the left, the positioning instinctive for 2 people who understood that walking abreast through hostile corridors was a tactical vulnerability. The keep was waking around them. Servants carried breakfast trays through the lower halls. Guards saluted as the Duke passed. The machinery of aristocratic life continued its grinding rhythm, while the man at its center carried a decoded letter that proved its chief engineer had been working for the competition. Captain Aldrich Thorne was a broad man in his early 40s with the scarred hands and compressed speech of a career soldier who had risen through merit rather than patronage. He commanded the Duke's personal reserve, 30 men selected from the general garrison and answerable only to Ciedric through a reporting structure that bypassed the steward's administrative authority entirely. It was a redundancy Ciedric had built into his security architecture years ago, not because he suspected Hadrian specifically, but because he suspected everyone generally. That paranoia was about to justify itself. 4 men, Ciedric said. You're most reliable, armed but not armored. I do not want this to look like an arrest until it becomes one. Thorne asked no questions. That was why Ciedric trusted him. They waited in the council chamber. Serafina sat at the table with the map and the decoded letter and a second document she had prepared. A chronological reconstruction of Hadrian's communication pattern over the past 8 years, cross-referenced with major strategic decisions that had failed or been compromised during the same period. The correlation was damning. 3 border operations that had been anticipated by Mircourt forces, 2 assassination attempts where the assailants had known Ciedric's exact schedule, a trade negotiation that collapsed when the opposing house produced confidential Blackthorn financial projections that should never have left the steward's office. 8 years of tactical failure explained by 3 paragraphs in a decoded letter. The 7th bell rang. Its sound traveled through the fortress like a pulse through a dying body, mechanical, rhythmic, indifferent to the catastrophe it was measuring. Footsteps in the corridor. Hadrian's cadence, precise, unhurried, the walk of a man who had spent 26 years moving through this fortress with the confidence of someone who believed his position was permanent. He opened the council chamber door and saw Ciedric standing at the head of the table, Serafina seated, 4 armed soldiers positioned at the walls, the decoded letter lying open on the oak surface. Hadrian's face did not change. That was the most devastating detail of all. His expression remained the same composed neutrality he had worn through 26 years of service. The mask so perfectly fitted to his features that it had become his actual face, and the man behind it had ceased to exist years ago. "Your Grace," he said. The same tone, the same measured respect, the same careful stillness around the eyes. "Close the door, Hadrian." The steward closed the door. His gaze traveled to the letter on the table, traveled to Serafina, traveled back to Ciedric. The calculation behind his eyes was rapid and total. The assessment of a man running scenarios at the speed of survival and arriving at the conclusion that none of them led anywhere good. "I assume you have questions," Hadrian said. "I have answers. What I need from you is confirmation." Ciedric picked up the decoded letter, held it where Hadrian could see the handwriting, his own handwriting, rendered into plaintext by the woman he had been monitoring for 3 weeks. 8 years. Hadrian said nothing. 8 years you sat in this fortress and fed my strategies to the one house capable of destroying everything I have built. 8 years of border intelligence, troop assessments, financial data. 3 failed operations. 2 assassination attempts with suspiciously accurate scheduling, a trade collapse that nearly bankrupted the eastern settlements. Hadrian's jaw tightened. Not guilt. Something closer to resignation. The expression of a man who had been carrying an unbearable weight for so long that its removal, even through exposure, provided a grotesque kind of relief. "The boy," Hadrian said. His voice cracked on the word. The first genuine sound Ciedric had heard from him in years, maybe ever. "They have my son." "I know." "You cannot know what that means." "I know exactly what that means. It means Mircourt found the one thing you valued more than your position and used it as a leash. It means every morning you woke up in this fortress and chose your son's life over my kingdom's security, and you told yourself that the trade was justified because the alternative was a dead child." Hadrian's composure fractured. Not completely. Men who had spent decades performing control did not collapse easily, but the cracks were visible now. Moisture in eyes that had been dry through 26 years of professional violence, a tremor in the hands that had managed every administrative function of the most feared household in the northern provinces. "You would have done the same," Hadrian whispered. The silence that followed was not empty, it was saturated, dense with the weight of a question that had no correct answer because both possible responses destroyed something essential. If Kaedric said yes, he admitted that his own principles were conditional. If he said no, he declared himself something less than human. He said neither. How many secondary contacts do you have inside the keep? Hadrian's mouth opened, closed. The transition from emotional appeal to interrogation was so abrupt that it severed whatever fragile bridge the confession had begun to construct. 3, he said. 2 in the kitchen staff, 1 in the stable management. Names. Hadrian gave them. Each name fell from his mouth with the weight of a coffin nail. Communication schedule? Every third supply run. Sealed packages in the grain storage. The wagon driver is paid but does not know the content. Contingency protocol if you were compromised? Hadrian hesitated. That hesitation contained something worse than the treason itself. It contained the knowledge that the betrayal had layers Kaedric had not yet reached. If I failed to deliver for 2 consecutive cycles, Hadrian said slowly, the contingency activates a military response. Meyercourt has a forward assault force positioned 12 hours from the southern border. Not the probing formations your scouts have reported. A full assault column, 3,000 infantry, 800 cavalry, siege equipment. The room contracted. Serafina's breath caught, audible this time, the involuntary response of someone who understood military logistics and recognized that 3,000 infantry with siege equipment was not a border dispute. It was an invasion. That force has been in position for how long? Kaedric's voice had dropped to a register that was barely human. The frequency of a sound produced under so much pressure that it had been compressed into something harder than speech. 6 weeks. 6 weeks. While Kaedric had been managing council politics and treasury audits and the delicate architecture of a marriage that was supposed to be purely strategic, an army large enough to breach Blackthorn Keep had been sitting 12 hours from his border waiting for a signal. And the signal, Kaedric said. What triggers the assault? Hadrian looked at him with an expression that contained the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. The piece that transformed a security breach into an existential catastrophe. My arrest. If Meyercourt's handlers confirm that I have been compromised, the assault launches within 24 hours. The contingency was designed as insurance. If I was exposed, Blackthorn Keep would fall before you could rebuild your intelligence network. The mathematics of the situation crystallized with brutal clarity. Kaedric could not arrest Hadrian without triggering an invasion he was not prepared to repel. He could not release Hadrian without allowing the intelligence leak to continue. He could not execute the traitor without signing the death warrant for his own fortress. Every option was a trap. Every response was a trigger. The man who had built his entire existence on the principle of absolute control was standing in a room where control had been engineered out of every available choice. Serafina spoke from the table. Her voice was steady, but her hands were pressed flat against the oak surface with enough pressure to whiten her knuckles. How long between delivery cycles? 6 days until the next scheduled transmission, Hadrian said. Then we have 6 days before Meyercourt expects contact, 6 days before silence triggers the contingency assessment. She looked at Kaedric. Hadrian cannot be arrested. He cannot be removed from his position. He has to continue performing his role as though nothing has changed while we reposition southern defenses to meet a threat we were not supposed to know about. You are asking me to leave a confirmed traitor operational inside my own fortress. I am asking you to choose strategy over instinct. Your instinct wants to destroy him. Your strategy needs him alive and functional for 6 more days. Kaedric turned back to Hadrian. The steward stood motionless between 2 soldiers, his face gray with the particular exhaustion of a man who had been holding 2 incompatible realities inside the same body for 8 years and had finally been forced to let one of them die. The Duke of Ravenspire had executed men for less. He had driven a dagger through a lord's hand for a public accusation. He had crushed noble houses for political positioning. He had built his reputation on the absolute certainty that betrayal met with immediate, theatrical, devastating consequence. And now the most devastating betrayal of his life required him to do the one thing his entire identity had been constructed to prevent. Nothing. He had to do nothing. He had to look at the man who had sold his kingdom and keep him standing, keep him functional, keep him performing the role of loyal steward while the walls he had weakened were reinforced in secret. He had to swallow the rage and the devastation and the howling primal need for retribution and convert it into patience. A currency he had never traded in, a language he had never spoken, a discipline that required not the strength to destroy, but the far more excruciating strength to wait. "Return to your quarters," Kedrick said to Hadrian. The words came from somewhere beneath the rage, beneath the betrayal, beneath the 9 years of solitary rule that had taught him to respond to threats with overwhelming force. They came from the place where survival lived, not the survival of ego or reputation or the carefully constructed mythology of Duke Blackthorn the Ruthless, but the survival of the province, the people, the physical infrastructure of a kingdom that would burn if he indulged the fury screaming inside his chest. "You will perform your duties exactly as before. You will deliver the next scheduled transmission on time with content I will provide. You will not contact your secondary assets. You will not deviate from your routine by 1 minute or 1 word. And when this is over, when Meyercourt's army is broken and your usefulness is exhausted, you and I will have a conversation that will not include soldiers or witnesses." Hadrian's eyes widened. The threat was worse than immediate execution. It was deferred judgment, an open account that would collect interest in darkness until the balance became something no man could pay. "My son," Hadrian began, "your son is the only reason you are still breathing. Do not test whether that reason is sufficient." The guards escorted Hadrian out. The door closed. The council chamber settled into a silence so dense it had physical weight. The silence of a room where the last illusion of safety had been stripped away, and nothing remained except the raw, exposed architecture of two people facing a crisis that exceeded the design capacity of everything they had built. Kedrick stood at the head of the table with his hands braced against the wood and his head bowed and his breathing controlled through a force of will that was visible in the rigid line of his shoulders. He was holding himself together the way a damaged structure holds itself together, through tension, through the desperate engagement of every remaining support beam against a collapse that felt not just possible, but gravitationally inevitable. Seraphina stood, walked to where he stood, stopped close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence without contact, the deliberate proximity of someone offering support without imposing it. "You made the right decision," she said. "I made the necessary decision. Those are not the same thing. In Ravenspire, they have to be." He raised his head, looked at her, and in that look something broke that could not be repaired. Not the trust he had lost in Hadrian, which was structural and political and could eventually be replaced with new systems and new personnel. What broke was older, deeper. The absolute load-bearing conviction that isolation was safety, that needing no one meant no one could destroy you, that the fortress of solitude he had built around himself was protection rather than slow suffocation. Because standing in this room with the ruins of his intelligence network scattered across the table and an invasion force 12 hours from his border, the only thing between Kedrick Blackthorn and total destruction was a woman he had married as a political transaction 23 days ago. She was the only person in the fortress whose loyalty had been tested under conditions designed to reveal treason and had emerged clean. The only person whose intelligence had identified the threat his own apparatus had missed. The only person standing in this room who was not a traitor, a suspect, or a soldier following orders. He needed her. Not wanted, needed. The way a man drowning needs the thing that keeps him above the waterline. And that need terrified him more than the army at his border, more than the traitor in his household, more than every assassination attempt and political conspiracy and aristocratic war he had survived through 9 years of brutal, solitary rule. Because needing someone meant they could be taken, and in Ravenspire, everything that could be taken eventually was. 6 days, he said. 6 days, she confirmed. 6 days to reposition an army, neutralize a spy network, and prepare for an invasion that would either be stopped at the border or stopped inside the walls of Blackthorn Keep itself. 6 days with a traitor walking free through his corridors. 6 days to become something he had never been, a man who could not survive alone. The first day burned through planning, the second through repositioning. By the third day, Kedrick had moved 1,400 soldiers from the eastern garrisons to concealed positions along the southern ridge without using a single communication channel that passed through Hadrian's administrative network. The orders traveled through Captain Thorne's independent chain of command, verbal directives delivered by mounted couriers who rode through frozen backtrails that did not appear on any official Blackthorn map. Serafina managed the logistical architecture. She requisitioned supply movements through the treasury under fabricated line items, northern infrastructure maintenance to cover ammunition transfers, seasonal agricultural preparation to mask the repositioning of field artillery to the southern tree line. The paperwork was immaculate. Anyone reviewing the ledgers would see routine provincial administration. No one would see an army being assembled in secret behind the facade of bureaucratic normalcy. They worked in the council chamber with the doors locked and the windows shuttered. Maps covered every surface. Serafina's red ink had spread across the topographical charts like arterial bleeding, troop positions, supply lines, terrain advantages, fallback routes. Kadrick's annotations were spare and brutal, single words at strategic points. Hold, collapse, kill zone. The language of a man who had studied warfare not as theory but as the primary mechanism of his continued existence. On the fourth day, Hadrian delivered his scheduled transmission. Kadrick had written the content personally. A military assessment reporting that Blackthorn forces were consolidating defensively around the keep in response to unspecified internal threats. The report suggested vulnerability, suggested confusion, suggested a duke distracted by domestic politics and slow to recognize the external danger gathering at his borders. Every word was engineered to make Meyercourt's commanders believe that the invasion window was widening, that hesitation was unnecessary, that Blackthorn Keep was ripe for assault. Hadrian carried the false report to the loading dock with the mechanical compliance of a man whose survival depended on performing a role he no longer believed in. Kadrick watched from the eastern tower window as the supply wagon departed through the main gate, carrying grain sacks and sealed intelligence toward the southern border. The steward walked back across the courtyard with his head down. His shadow stretched behind him on the frozen stones, elongated, distorted, the shape of a man being pulled in a direction he could not resist. Kadrick turned from the window, found Serafina standing in the doorway of the tower, the eastern tower, his private space, the one area of the fortress he had explicitly forbidden her from entering without permission. She had not asked permission. "The Southern Scouts report movement," she said. "Meyercourt's forward elements are breaking camp. They are committing." "How long?" "Based on march speed with siege equipment, 36 hours to the border. Another 12 to reach assault range of the keep. 48 hours. Kadrick looked at the woman standing in his doorway. The doorway no one else crossed. The threshold that marked the boundary between the Duke the world saw and the man who existed in isolation behind the performance. She stood there without apology, without the theatrical deference that every other human being in his life deployed as protective camouflage. She stood there because 48 hours from now, the fortress might burn, and the distinction between permitted and forbidden spaces would become meaningless. "You should not be here," he said. The words carried no force. They were the last reflex of a boundary system that had already been dismantled from the inside. "You should not be alone. I have been alone for 9 years. And in 9 years, you missed an 8-year intelligence breach, 3 compromised military operations, and an invasion force assembling 12 hours from your border. Solitude is not working for you, Kadrick." His name, not his title, not his honorific, not the formal address that maintained the architecture of power between a duke and everyone beneath him. His name, spoken in the same flat, unflinching tone she used to deliver treasury analysis and strategic assessments. He should have corrected her, should have reasserted the distance that protocol required and survival demanded, should have reminded her that names were intimate, and intimacy was leverage, and leverage was the mechanism by which powerful men were destroyed. He said nothing. Serafina crossed the threshold, entered the eastern tower for the first time. Her eyes moved across the austere space, the weapons rack, the writing desk, the narrow bed with wool blankets, the whiskey decanter that was 3/4 empty. She absorbed the room the way she absorbed everything, systematically, without judgment, filing details into a cognitive architecture that processed information faster than anyone Kadrick had encountered. "This is where you live," she said. It was not a question. It was an observation delivered with a weight that transformed a simple statement into something that cut deeper than any accusation. This is where you live. 4 walls and a weapons rack, and a desk with a loaded pistol and a vial of antidote. This is the space you retreated to after executing lords and crushing rebellions, and performing the mythology of Duke Blackthorn the Ruthless. This is the monument to your isolation, and it looks exactly like what it is. A cell you built yourself and called a fortress. Kedrick felt something shift inside his chest. Not the controlled, analyzable movement of strategic calculation. Something tectonic. Something that had been locked in position for years under the sustained pressure of willpower, and was now grinding loose because the pressure had become unsustainable. In 48 hours, this castle may be under siege, he said. We need to discuss evacuation protocols. I am not evacuating. That was not a suggestion. And that was not compliance. Serafina turned to face him fully. The tower window threw cold light across her features, illuminating the iron in her eyes and the set of her jaw that he had come to recognize as the expression she wore when she had made a decision that no amount of authority would reverse. You need me inside this fortress when the assault begins. Not because of sentiment, because I am the only person in your command structure who understands both the financial logistics and the military positioning well enough to coordinate supply distribution under siege conditions. Your captain fights, your chancellor panics, your steward is a traitor. I am what is left. The brutal pragmatism of the statement stripped away every possible romantic interpretation and replaced it with something harder and more honest. She was not staying because she loved him. She was staying because she was necessary, and in Ravenspire, necessity was the only argument that overruled the Duke. If the walls are breached, he started, if the walls are breached, we both die. That was true the moment I entered this fortress as your wife. The marriage contract made my survival contingent on yours. I accepted that equation 23 days ago. Do not insult me by pretending it is news. Kedrick looked at her for a long time. The light shifted as clouds moved across the mountain peaks. Shadows traveled across the tower walls like the hands of a clock, measuring time in a currency that had suddenly become scarce. You are the most infuriating woman I have ever met, he said, and you are the most isolated man I have ever met. Between the two of us, my condition is more treatable. Something happened to his face, not a smile. His musculature had forgotten how to produce that expression years ago, but a softening, a microscopic relaxation of the tension that lived permanently in the muscles around his eyes and jaw. It lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3. A hairline fracture in a wall that had been load-bearing for a decade. Then the war drums started. Not literal drums, the urgent, staccato pounding of a messenger's fist against the tower door. Captain Thorne's voice, tight with the controlled adrenaline of a career soldier delivering catastrophic intelligence. Your Grace, the Southern Scouts report Meyercourt's vanguard is moving faster than projected. They have abandoned the siege equipment, light cavalry and infantry only. Estimated arrival at the border crossing also 18 hours. 18, not 48. Meyercourt had split his forces. The siege column would follow at standard pace, but the fast assault group, cavalry and foot soldiers unburdened by heavy equipment, was sprinting for the border. It was a gamble. Without siege weapons, they could not breach the keep's walls through conventional assault. But they could reach the southern settlements, destroy supply infrastructure, and cut the roads that connected Blackthorn's repositioned forces to their logistical base. They were not coming for the castle. They were coming for the kingdom. Kedrick descended the tower stairs 3 at a time. Serafina followed. The fortress was already shifting into wartime configuration. Servants clearing corridors, soldiers moving toward armories, the massive iron gates of the inner courtyard grinding shut with a sound like the earth cracking open. In the council chamber, maps were already spread and re-weighted. Captain Thorne pointed to the southern border with a finger that did not tremble despite the information it was delivering. If Meyercourt's light force hits the southern villages, they sever the supply road between our repositioned garrison and the keep. 1,400 men cut off from resupply within 48 hours. They can fight, but they cannot sustain. Then we do not let them reach the villages, Kedrick said. We intercept at the Ashford Narrows. Thorne looked up sharply. The Narrows are 6 hours south of our current line. To reach them before Meyercourt's vanguard, we would need to force march the entire repositioned garrison through the night, in winter conditions, over mountain terrain. Yes, Your Grace, a night march in these conditions will cost us. Men will fall out, equipment will be lost. We will arrive at the Narrows with a force that has been marching for 6 hours in freezing temperatures against a cavalry force that has been riding fresh. And if we do not march, we lose the supply road, our garrison starves, and Meyercourt's siege column arrives 3 days later to find a fortress without an army. Those are the options, Captain. Exhausted soldiers at a choke point or well-rested soldiers with no food. Choose. Thorn chose. Because there was no choice. There was only the least catastrophic version of a situation where every possibility carried a body count. I ride with them, Cedric said. The room went silent. Your Grace, Thorn began, if I send 1,400 men on a forced night march to fight a battle that will determine whether this province survives the week, I will be at the front of the column. Not because I need to be. Because men who are about to march through frozen mountains toward an enemy they cannot see need to know that the man who ordered them to do it is eating the same cold and breathing the same thin air. That is the difference between a duke and a general. A duke sends orders, a general carries them. He turned to Serafina. The keep is yours. The words landed in the room with a weight that exceeded their tactical meaning. He was not simply assigning her administrative authority during his absence. He was placing the entirety of Blackthorn Keep, the fortress, the household, the remaining garrison, the political infrastructure of the most powerful duchy in the northern provinces, under the control of a woman who had been his wife for 24 days and his strategic partner for less than a week. He was trusting her, completely, without conditions, without surveillance networks, without the elaborate systems of verification and redundancy that had defined every relationship in his adult life. He was doing it because the alternative was leaving the fortress in the hands of a compromised steward or an incompetent chancellor, and because somewhere in the last 6 days, the terrifying mathematics of necessity had produced a result that his emotional architecture was not designed to process. He trusted her more than he trusted himself. Serafina held his gaze. Hadrian? Remains under watch. Thorn's reserve unit stays inside the keep. If he deviates from routine, if he attempts communication, if he walks toward a corridor he does not normally use, you make the call. And if the call requires permanent resolution, Cedric's jaw tightened. Then you resolve it permanently and you do not hesitate. He was giving her authority to execute his steward, the man who had served his father, the man who had managed his household for nearly a decade, the man who had betrayed everything but was also a father with a son held hostage by the enemy. The complexity of that authorization, the moral weight, the political implications, the raw human cost, compressed into a single sentence delivered with the flat efficiency of a man who had run out of time for nuance. The column departed 2 hours before midnight. 1,400 men in winter gear moving south through mountain passes that were treacherous in daylight and potentially lethal in darkness. Torches were forbidden. Light would signal their position to any Meyercourt scouts operating in the foothills. They marched by moonlight and memory, following trails that the older soldiers knew from border patrols, and the younger soldiers navigated through pure trust in the man riding at the front of the formation. Cedric rode a black warhorse that had been bred for mountain terrain, sure-footed, massive, with the endurance of an animal that had been trained to carry armored weight through conditions that would kill lesser stock. He wore his battle coat, heavy black leather over chain mesh, no cape, no ceremonial ornamentation. The coat had been cut for movement, not appearance. It carried scars from 2 previous engagements, and the left shoulder bore a patch where a crossbow bolt had been extracted on a battlefield 3 years ago. The cold was extraordinary. Wind carved through the mountain pass like a blade made of pure temperature, finding gaps in clothing, numbing exposed skin within minutes, turning breath into dense clouds that dissipated instantly in the rushing air. Soldiers marched with their heads down and their arms tight against their bodies, conserving warmth through compression, sacrificing peripheral awareness for the basic biological necessity of keeping their core temperature above the threshold where muscles stopped functioning. Cedric felt the cold the way he felt everything, as data. Temperature dropping, wind speed increasing, visibility declining as clouds obscured the partial moon. These were variables in an equation whose solution would determine whether 1,400 men arrived at the Ashford Narrows in fighting condition or stumbled out of the mountains as frozen casualties before the battle even began. 5 hours into the march, the first soldiers began to fall. Not dramatically, not the theatrical collapse of men in stories, quietly. A stumble that became a stagger, that became a stop. Men sitting down on frozen rocks with the dull, resigned expression of bodies that had decided to shut down regardless of what the mind commanding them wanted. Each fallen soldier required a decision: stop the column to assist, or continue and leave them. Each decision cost something. Stopping cost time. Continuing cost men. Kadric did not stop. Not because he did not care. The notion that ruthlessness and compassion were opposites was a lie told by people who had never been forced to choose between them in conditions where both were fatal in different time frames. He did not stop because the 1,400 men still moving needed to reach the Narrows before Meyercourt's cavalry, and every minute of delay narrowed the margin between interception and annihilation. The things a man discovered about himself during a forced march through frozen mountains at 3 in the morning were not the things he expected to discover. Kadric had spent his adult life believing that strength was the capacity to endure alone, that the man who needed nothing from anyone was the man who could not be destroyed. That isolation was armor and solitude was strategy, and the absence of connection was the price of power, paid willingly and without regret. But marching through darkness with 1,400 men whose survival depended on his judgment, Kadric understood something that 9 years of solitary rule had not taught him. Strength was not the ability to carry weight alone. It was the willingness to carry weight that mattered to other people. The soldiers behind him were not following his title or his reputation or his capacity for violence. They were following a man who had chosen to freeze alongside them instead of issuing orders from a heated tower. That was the lesson the cold taught, when it stripped away everything ornamental and left only the raw structure of what a man actually was beneath the performance of what he claimed to be. Dawn broke as the column reached the northern rim of the Ashford Narrows, a natural choke point where the mountain terrain compressed into a valley barely 400 yards wide, flanked by steep ridges covered in dense evergreen forest. It was the strongest defensive position within a day's ride of the southern border. An army entering from the south would be funneled into the narrow valley floor, exposed to fire from elevated positions on both flanks. If Kadric's force reached the ridgelines before Meyercourt's cavalry reached the valley, the engagement would be a massacre. The right kind of massacre. The kind that ended wars before they began. "Deploy along both ridges," Kadric ordered. His voice was raw from cold and 6 hours of breathing mountain air. "Archers on the upper slopes. Heavy infantry at the valley floor to block the exit. Cavalry in reserve behind the northern tree line." Thorne relayed the orders with the efficiency of a man who understood that the next 2 hours would determine the future of Ravenspire. Soldiers who had spent 6 hours marching through freezing darkness now scrambled up forested ridges to establish firing positions. Exhaustion was visible in every movement, the sluggishness of muscles that had burned through their reserves, the fumbling of fingers too numb to properly grip weapons, the 1,000 small mechanical failures that accumulated in human bodies pushed beyond design limits. But they moved. They climbed. They positioned themselves along the ridgelines with the grim determination of men who understood that the man who had marched beside them through the worst night of their lives was now standing at the bottom of the valley, asking them to fight. Kadric dismounted at the valley floor, drew his sword. The blade was not ceremonial. It was a combat weapon, heavy, balanced for power over speed, with an edge that had been honed that morning by a man who understood that the difference between a sharp blade and a dull one was measured in the lives it cost the person wielding it. 40 minutes later, the first Meyercourt scouts appeared at the southern mouth of the Narrows. They rode fast, 2 outriders on light horses, moving through the valley at reconnaissance speed, scanning the terrain for obstacles and threats. They reached the midpoint of the Narrows before they saw the Blackthorn infantry blocking the northern exit. One scout turned to retreat. An arrow from the eastern ridge caught him between the shoulder blades. He fell from his horse without a sound. The second scout pulled hard on his reins, looked up at the forested ridgelines, saw the archers, saw the infantry, saw the trap. He did not make it back to the southern entrance. 20 minutes of silence followed. The wind moved through the Narrows, carrying the smell of pine and cold stone. Cadric stood at the front of the infantry line, with his sword drawn and his breathing steady, and the absolute clarity of a man who had passed beyond exhaustion into the crystalline state where the body stops complaining and simply functions at whatever level is required to keep the organism alive. Then Meyercourt's vanguard appeared. 800 cavalry and 1,600 infantry, moving through the southern mouth of the Narrows in a column formation that had been designed for speed rather than combat readiness. They expected to pass through the valley without resistance. They expected to reach the southern villages by nightfall and sever Blackthorn's supply infrastructure, while the Duke sat in his fortress managing political crises. They did not expect 1,400 men on the ridgelines and a Duke standing in their path with a drawn sword and the expression of a man who had spent 6 hours in the freezing dark, converting every ounce of personal suffering into tactical fury. Cadric's voice carried through the valley like a cannon shot. "Archers, on my signal." The Meyercourt column halted. Officers screamed orders. Cavalry tried to wheel into combat formation within the narrow confines of the valley floor. Horses colliding, riders cursing, the chaos of a force caught in a choke point that had been selected specifically to produce this exact kind of tactical paralysis. Cadric raised his sword, held it. The moment stretched. 3 seconds, 5, 7. Each second a deliberate extension of the psychological pressure on an enemy that could see the trap closing and could not move fast enough to escape it. He brought the blade down. Arrows fell from both ridgelines like black rain. The first volley struck the forward cavalry formation with the dense percussive impact of concentrated fire against massed targets. Horses screamed. Men fell. The column's momentum shattered as the front ranks collapsed into the ranks behind them, creating a wall of dying animals and struggling riders that blocked the valley floor more effectively than any physical barricade. The second volley landed 12 seconds later, the third 8 seconds after that. The archers on the ridgelines fired with the methodical precision of men operating a machine designed to convert human beings into casualties at industrial scale. Below them, the Meyercourt force was disintegrating, cavalry unable to charge through their own dead, infantry unable to form defensive lines in a valley too narrow for conventional deployment. Cadric charged. Not tactically, not strategically. He charged into the collapsing enemy formation at the head of his infantry because the men behind him needed to see the Duke covered in the same blood and chaos that they were about to enter. And because the difference between a leader who directed violence from a distance and a leader who waded into it personally was the difference between an army that fought and an army that fought to the last man standing. The valley became a slaughterhouse. Steel against steel in a space too confined for maneuver, too choked with bodies for retreat, too saturated with noise and blood and terror for any rational calculation. Cadric fought with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had trained with weapons since childhood and had been forced to use them in earnest more times than he could count. Each strike was economic. No wasted motion, no theatrical flourishes, just the relentless application of force against targets that appeared and disappeared in the churning chaos of close combat. Blood mixed with sweat on his face. His breathing came in ragged bursts that tasted like iron. A Meyercourt soldier's blade caught him across the ribs. Not deep enough to be fatal, deep enough to send a shock of white-hot pain through his left side that nearly dropped him. He absorbed the impact, pivoted, killed the man who had cut him with a single thrust that used the momentum of the pivot to drive the blade through chain mesh and into the space between the third and fourth rib. The man fell. Another took his place. The mathematics of violence continued its brutal accounting. Lives spent, lives taken, the relentless balance sheet of a battle that would be measured in bodies rather than territory. 2 hours. The battle lasted 2 hours, though time inside the Narrows had ceased to function in any measurable way. Minutes stretched and compressed. Sound became a solid wall of metal and screaming, and the deep concussive impact of massed bodies colliding in a space designed by geography to maximize the effectiveness of the force that held the high ground. Blackthorn held the high ground. When it ended, the valley floor was carpeted with Meyercourt dead and dying. 800 cavalry reduced to fragments, 1,600 infantry broken into scattered groups that retreated south through the Narrows, pursued by Blackthorn soldiers who had spent 6 hours freezing in the darkness and 2 hours killing in the daylight and had not yet exhausted the reservoir of fury that the Duke's midnight march had filled. Kedrick stood in the center of the valley, with his sword arm hanging at his side, and blood running freely from the wound across his ribs. His breathing was ragged. His vision flickered at the edges, the body's warning system signaling that blood loss and exhaustion were approaching the threshold beyond which voluntary function became involuntary collapse. Captain Thorne appeared beside him, blood on his face, his left arm hanging at an angle that suggested a break or severe dislocation. "Vanguard is broken. Southern retreat in progress. Shall we pursue?" "No. Reform the line. Hold the narrows." Kedrick's voice was barely audible above the moaning of the wounded that filled the valley like a wind made of human pain. "The siege column is still coming. 3 days. Your Grace, you need medical. I need this valley held. Everything else is secondary." He turned north, toward the keep, toward the fortress where his wife was managing a household that contained a traitor and a skeleton garrison and the entire administrative infrastructure of a kingdom that had just fought its first engagement in a war that was far from over. Toward the woman who had made all of this possible by seeing what he could not see and knowing what he refused to know and standing in his doorway without permission because she understood that the most dangerous thing in Ravenspire was not the enemy at the gates. It was the Duke who believed he had to fight them alone. A rider met him at the base of the northern trail. One of Thorne's reserve messengers, riding hard from the direction of Blackthorn Keep, with an expression that turned Kedrick's blood colder than the mountain air. "Your Grace." The rider was out of breath. His horse was lathered. "Message from the Duchess. Hadrian Coles attempted to access the Eastern Armory 2 hours after your departure. The reserve guard intercepted him. During the confrontation, he revealed a secondary communication device, a signal mirror on the southern tower. He had already transmitted." Kedrick's blood-streaked hand tightened on his sword hilt until the leather wrapping creaked. "Transmitted what?" "Your position, the narrows, the full deployment. Meyercourt's siege column knows where you are, Your Grace, and they are not 3 days out." The rider swallowed. "They force march through the night, siege equipment abandoned on the road, full infantry commitment. Estimated arrival at the Ashford Narrows?" The rider's voice cracked. 6 hours. 3,000 fresh soldiers, 6 hours away, bearing down on a force of 1,400 men who had just fought for 2 hours after a 6-hour night march through frozen mountains. Men who were bleeding and exhausted and standing in a valley full of corpses with a wounded duke at their center and nowhere left to retreat. Kedrick looked south through the narrows. The valley stretched before him. Narrow, blood-soaked, choked with the debris of a battle he had just won. In 6 hours, it would become the site of the battle that would determine whether House Blackthorn survived or burned. And he was standing at its center with a sword in his hand and blood running down his side, and the absolute terrifying certainty that the next 6 hours would require him to become something he had never been. Not ruthless. He had always been ruthless. Not brave. Bravery was a performance for people who had alternatives. Something worse. Something that had no name in the vocabulary of men who built their identities on control and isolation and the refusal to need anything from anyone. Something that required him to look at the 1,400 exhausted, bleeding, freezing men standing in this valley and ask them to die with him. Not for him, with him. And to mean it in a way that was not performance, not command, not the calculated theater of a duke managing his soldiers' morale. To mean it the way a man means it, when he has finally understood that the fortress he built around himself was never protection. It was the thing that almost killed him. 6 hours. 1,400 men standing in a valley that smelled like iron and death. Their muscles locked with cold and exhaustion, their weapons heavy with someone else's blood. And a duke at their center with a wound leaking through his coat, and the knowledge that 3,000 fresh soldiers were marching toward this valley with orders to finish what the vanguard had failed to accomplish. Kedrick sheathed his sword. The gesture was deliberate, a man putting away one tool and reaching for another. Violence had won the first battle. Violence alone would not win the second. Not with these numbers, not with this level of physical depletion, not against a force that outnumbered his own 2-to-1 and had the advantage of rested legs and unbroken formations. He needed something else. Something he had never deployed in his entire career as Duke of Ravenspire because he had never believed it existed as a tactical resource. He needed these men to choose to stay, not obey, not comply, not follow orders because the alternative was execution or disgrace. Choose. The way human beings choose when every rational calculation argues for retreat and something irrational, something deeper than strategy, older than discipline, keeps them standing. Captain Thorne limped toward him through the aftermath. His broken arm had been splinted with a rifle stock and strips torn from a dead man's uniform. His face was gray with pain and blood loss, and the particular exhaustion of a professional soldier who understood the mathematics of their situation and could not make the numbers work. Your Grace, we cannot hold this position against 3,000, even with the terrain advantage, even with the ridge lines. Our archers are down to 30% ammunition. Infantry is combat depleted. We have approximately 400 men with significant wounds that will degrade their fighting capability within hours. I know. If we withdraw north now, we can reach the secondary defensive line at Coldridge before Meyercourt's column arrives. It is not ideal terrain, but it preserves the force for... If we withdraw, Meyercourt takes the Narrows. Once they control this choke point, they have uncontested access to the southern settlements. Supply roads severed, agricultural base destroyed. Blackthorn Keep under siege within a week with no resupply corridor. Kedrick looked at the valley stretching south, the killing ground they had just created, littered with the evidence of what concentrated force could accomplish when geography and determination converged. We hold here or we lose everything. There is no middle position. Thorne absorbed this. His jaw worked silently. The calculation behind his eyes was not cowardice. It was the honest arithmetic of a man who had spent his career keeping soldiers alive and was now being asked to accept that the mission required spending them. They will need to hear it from you, Thorne said finally. Not an order. They have followed orders all night. They need something else now. Kedrick knew what Thorne meant. He had watched his father do it once. Stand before exhausted men and say the thing that transformed tired bodies into weapons. The old Duke had possessed that ability naturally, the way some men possessed physical grace or musical talent, the capacity to speak to the part of a man that existed beneath rank and training and self-preservation. Kedrick had never attempted it. He ruled through fear and efficiency. He gave directives. He did not inspire. Inspiration required vulnerability, and vulnerability was the one currency he had never been willing to spend. Until now. He climbed onto a supply wagon that had been positioned as a barricade near the valley's northern end. The elevation gave him visibility across the entire formation. 1,400 men scattered along the valley floor and the ridge lines, sitting among the dead, tending wounds, drinking from canteens with the mechanical movements of organisms operating on reserves that were nearly depleted. They looked up at him. Not with the sharp attention of soldiers receiving orders, with the heavy, bloodshot gaze of men who had already given everything they were designed to give and were waiting to find out if the man who had spent it intended to demand the remainder. Kedrick did not raise his voice. In the narrow valley, sound carried with a clarity that made shouting unnecessary and would have felt dishonest. I am not going to tell you that reinforcements are coming. They are not. I am not going to tell you that the odds are in our favor. They are not. I am not going to tell you that what I am asking is reasonable, because it is not reasonable. It is the opposite of reasonable. It is the kind of decision that only makes sense if you believe that some things matter more than surviving the day. Silence. Absolute silence. Even the wounded had stopped groaning. 3,000 men are coming through that valley in 6 hours. If they pass through, Ravenspire burns. Not the castle, not the banners. The farms your families work, the villages your children sleep in, the roads your wives walk to market. That is what is on the other side of this decision. Not my title, not my dynasty. Your lives, the actual physical places where the people you care about exist. He paused. Let the silence work the way he had always let silence work. Not as absence, but as pressure, as a space where the meaning of what had been said could expand to fill the available volume. I am staying, not because I have to, because this valley is where it ends. One way or another, this is where Meyercourt learns that Ravenspire does not fall. And if I am going to die, I am going to die in front of you, not behind you. That is the only thing I can promise. That and this. Every man who walks north right now walks free. No punishment, no dishonor. You have already fought harder tonight than any army in this province's history. No one will call you cowards. I will not allow it." He stepped down from the wagon. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then a soldier in the front rank, a young man with a gash across his forehead that had crusted into a mask of dried blood, drove his sword point into the frozen earth and stayed standing. Another did the same. Then 5. Then 20. Then a sound rose from the valley that was not a cheer or a war cry, but something lower and more primal. The collective exhalation of men who had decided. Not all of them. Kedrick counted approximately 90 men who gathered their equipment and moved north along the trail. He watched them go without judgment. 90 men out of 1,400. The rest stayed. 1,310 soldiers who had nothing left to give except the decision to remain, which turned out to be the most powerful resource an army could possess. The next 5 hours were preparation at a pace that bordered on the frantic. Kedrick redesigned the defensive layout with the focused intensity of a man solving the last problem he might ever solve. The valley's natural contours became force multipliers. Fallen trees dragged into choke points, cavalry horses repositioned as mobile barricades, the Meyercourt dead stripped of usable arrows and distributed to archers on the ridgelines. Serafina's influence appeared in ways that surprised him. The supply wagon she had provisioned for the original march contained medical kits far exceeding standard military allocation. Someone had anticipated casualties and packed accordingly. The ammunition reserves included bundles of fire arrows that had not been part of Captain Thorne's requisition. When Kedrick asked Thorne about the discrepancy, the captain shook his head. The Duchess amended the supply manifest before departure. Said you would need them. She had known. Before the vanguard appeared, before the battle, before the intelligence about the siege column, she had packed for a larger fight than the one they were planning. Because she understood that plans were what happened before reality arrived. And reality in Ravenspire always arrived with more soldiers than expected. Kedrick felt something in his chest that had nothing to do with the wound across his ribs. A warmth that was not physical. A sensation he could not name because his vocabulary had never needed a word for what it felt like when another person anticipated your destruction and quietly prepared to prevent it without asking for credit or permission. The siege column arrived at the southern mouth of the Narrows 40 minutes ahead of schedule. 3,000 men, infantry in tight formation, officers on horseback screaming commands that echoed off the valley walls. The column was disciplined. These were not the overconfident cavalrymen of the morning assault. These were Meyercourt's core infantry, professional soldiers who had been training for this campaign for months, marching behind banners that bore the silver wolf of House Meyercourt and the motto that Kedrick had spent his entire life ensuring remained aspirational rather than descriptive. We inherit. Not today. Archers, Kedrick said. Fire arrows launched from both ridgelines. Not aimed at the soldiers, aimed at the ground. The valley floor had been soaked with lamp oil from the supply wagons during the preparation hours, concentrated in narrow bands across the most likely advance routes. The fire arrows hit the oil, and the valley floor erupted in lines of flame that bisected the Meyercourt column into 3 segments, each suddenly isolated from the others by walls of burning earth. The tactic was crude, temporary, and borrowed from a siege warfare manual that Serafina had found in the Blackthorn Library and flagged with a notation that read, "Oil dispersal patterns for confined terrain." She had left the book on his desk 2 days ago. He had read it on the march. The fire would burn for 20 minutes, maybe less in the cold, but 20 minutes of chaos in an enemy formation that had expected to roll through the valley unopposed was enough to change the fundamental character of the engagement. Meyercourt's officers lost command coherence. Units that had been trained to fight as a coordinated mass were suddenly operating as 3 independent fragments, each receiving conflicting orders, each making autonomous decisions about whether to advance through the flames or hold position. Kedrick's infantry hit the northernmost fragment while the fires still burned. The fighting was different this time, not the frantic, compressed violence of the morning battle. This was sustained, grinding, attritional combat, 2 forces locked together in a space too narrow for maneuver, trading casualties at a rate that neither side could afford, but neither side would stop. Kedrick fought in the front rank again, not because it was strategically optimal, A dead commander was a strategic catastrophe, because the men beside him were fighting on fumes and faith, and the only thing keeping them vertical was the visible presence of the man who had promised to die in front of them instead of behind them. The wound in his side reopened during the first hour. He felt the wet heat of blood soaking through the field dressing and into the lining of his coat. His left arm weakened as the blood loss accumulated. He shifted his sword to a two-handed grip to compensate, sacrificing speed for stability, adapting to the degradation the way a machine adapts to failing components, rerouting function through whatever system still operated. 2 hours in, the fires died. Meyercourt's 3 fragments attempted to reconsolidate. Kedrick pulled his infantry back to the prepared choke points and let the archers resume volley fire from the ridgelines. The valley became a killing corridor again, arrows falling in disciplined waves onto troops who were bunched together by the terrain and could not disperse without climbing ridges held by Blackthorn soldiers who had the psychological advantage of fighting from high ground they had earned through a night of frozen misery. The third hour broke Meyercourt's center. It did not happen dramatically. No single moment of collapse. The center fragment, approximately 1,000 men who had been caught between 2 fire lines and subjected to continuous archery for over an hour, began to lose cohesion. Men stopped advancing. Officers stopped commanding. The invisible structure that held a military unit together, the shared belief that forward movement served some purpose that justified the risk, dissolved like ice in warm water. Slowly, then completely. They retreated. Not en route. In the exhausted, purposeless drift of men who had stopped believing that the objective ahead of them was achievable. The southern fragment followed within 30 minutes. Their commander, a lord whose name Kedrick would learn later and immediately forget, pulled his forces back through the valley's southern mouth after witnessing the center's collapse and calculating that his 1,000 remaining men were insufficient to achieve what 3,000 had failed to accomplish. The northern fragment fought longest. 800 men pinned against Blackthorn's choke points with nowhere to retreat, fighting with the desperate energy of soldiers who understood that their options had narrowed to victory or death. Kedrick's forces ground them down through sustained pressure. Not elegant, not efficient, just the relentless application of force against a shrinking perimeter until the Meyercourt officers threw their swords at Kedrick's feet and called for terms. The Battle of the Ashford Narrows ended 6 hours and 14 minutes after the siege column entered the valley. Meyercourt's losses were catastrophic. Combined with the morning vanguard destruction, House Meyercourt had committed over 5,000 soldiers to the invasion of Ravenspire and lost over 3,000 in a single day. The military capacity to threaten Blackthorn territory was not merely damaged, it was eliminated. The kind of loss that took a generation to rebuild, if rebuilding was even possible for a house whose political credibility had been staked on a campaign that ended in the worst military defeat in provincial history. Kedrick's losses were severe. 247 dead, over 400 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation. Nearly half his fighting force removed from operational capacity in a single engagement. He stood in the valley as the winter sun dropped behind the western mountains, and the temperature plunged and the fires on the valley floor guttered into smoke that rose through the cold air like the exhaled breath of the earth itself. His coat was soaked with blood, his own and others. The wound in his side had been field-dressed twice during the fighting by a medic who had told him plainly that continued physical exertion would kill him, and whom Kedrick had ignored with the polite indifference of a man who was not accepting applications for common sense at that particular moment. He was alive. His kingdom was intact. The enemy was broken. And he felt nothing. Not triumph, not relief, not the fierce satisfaction that was supposed to accompany victory in the stories that aristocratic children were told about their glorious ancestors. He felt the specific leaden emptiness of a man standing in a field of dead people who had been alive that morning and were now cooling on frozen ground because 2 noble houses had disagreed about territory and resources, and the fundamental question of whose banner flew over which stretch of mountain and valley. This was what power cost, not the abstract cost calculated in treasury ledgers and diplomatic concessions, the physical cost, the actual dead men cost, the cost that could be counted by walking through the valley and stepping over bodies that had been fathers and sons and brothers before they became obstacles on the ground. Kadrick let himself feel it, all of it, the weight of every body. The knowledge that his decisions, strategically sound, tactically brilliant, the kind of military performance that would be studied and admired and taught to future officers, had produced this field of human wreckage. He did not flinch from it. Flinching was how men in his position learned to do it again. The only defense against becoming addicted to the exercise of lethal power was forcing yourself to stand in the result and refuse to look away. The ride back to Blackthorn Keep took 8 hours. Kadrick rode at the front of the column despite Thorne's increasingly forceful suggestions that he ride in the medical wagon. The pain in his side had evolved from sharp to deep, a slow, grinding ache that pulsed with his heartbeat and sent waves of nausea through his stomach when the horse's gait jarred the wound. He rode because stopping meant acknowledging that his body had limits, and acknowledging limits meant confronting the possibility that the last 36 hours had consumed something that would not regenerate. Not physical stamina, something internal, something structural. The particular kind of fuel that burned when a man pushed past every boundary he had built around himself and operated in the open space beyond, where there were no walls and no masks and no performances, just the raw mechanism of a human being doing what was necessary. Blackthorn Keep appeared through the morning mist like a hallucination, black walls rising from the cliffs, banners snapping in the mountain wind. The fortress that had been his cage and his throne and his entire world for 9 years, now visible from a distance that made it look both smaller and more significant than it had ever seemed from inside. The gates opened. The courtyard filled with household staff and garrison soldiers, and the organized chaos of a fortress receiving a returning army. Voices shouted, horses stamped. Wounded men were carried toward the medical quarters. Serafina stood at the top of the entrance stairs. She was not wearing court dress. She was wearing the practical riding clothes she had arrived in 27 days ago. Dark wool, boots, no jewelry. Her face carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent the last 36 hours managing a fortress under wartime conditions while simultaneously overseeing the detention of a compromised steward and maintaining the administrative infrastructure of a kingdom whose duke had ridden off to die in a mountain valley. Kadrick dismounted. The act of swinging his leg over the horse sent a bolt of pain through his wound that grayed his vision at the edges. He steadied himself against the animal's flank, took a breath, walked toward the stairs. 27 days ago, he had met this woman in the council chamber and asked her if she could survive here. She had listed the things she had already survived: Thornhaven politics, Lord Calloway's retaliation, her own father's transactional cruelty, with the flat precision of a woman reciting a resume of damage. He had not understood then. He understood now. Survival was not the absence of destruction. It was what remained after destruction had taken everything it could reach and found that something at the center refused to disappear. He stopped at the base of the stairs, looked up at her. His face was streaked with blood and dirt and the residue of a battle that would reshape the political landscape of the northern provinces. His eyes carried something she had not seen in them before. Not the cold analytical assessment, not the dangerous interest, not the controlled emptiness that served as his default expression. Exhaustion. The genuine, unperformed, structurally compromising kind. The kind that could only exist on a face that had stopped managing its own presentation. "It is done," he said. "I know. The scouts reported 3 hours ago." She descended 2 steps, stopped. "Hadrian is in the lower detention cells. He attempted to use the signal mirror while you were engaged. The reserve guard subdued him. He is unharmed." "And his network?" "The 3 contacts he identified have been detained. I found a 4th he did not mention, a stable worker who was maintaining a secondary courier route through the eastern woodlands. I had the route mapped and the courier intercepted. The communications have been preserved for your review." She delivered this information with the same Treasury report efficiency she brought to everything, organized, comprehensive, stripped of emotional content. But her eyes moved across his body with a different kind of assessment, cataloging the blood, measuring the pallor, calculating the severity of the wound he was trying to conceal through the simple, stubborn refusal to acknowledge its existence. "You are injured," she said. "I am functional. Those are not the same thing, and you know it." He climbed the stairs. Each step cost something. By the time he reached the landing where she stood, His breathing was audible, and his left hand was pressed against his side in a way that was no longer concealment, but support. They stood face to face, close enough that he could see the individual threads of silver in the chain at her throat, close enough that she could see the network of new cuts across his hands, where the sword grip had worn through his gloves during 6 hours of fighting. "You packed fire arrows," he said. "They were not in the requisition." I read the terrain reports for the Narrows. The valley floor composition was conducive to oil dispersal. It seemed prudent. Prudent. He almost laughed. The sound that emerged was closer to a cough, rough, painful, produced by a body that had forgotten how laughter worked, but remembered the impulse. "You anticipated a siege engagement before the intelligence confirmed it. You packed for a battle I did not know I was going to fight." Someone needed to plan for the possibility that things would go wrong. You were busy planning for the possibility that things would go right. Is that a criticism? It is a job description. You fight the war. I make sure you survive it. That seems like a functional division of labor for two people running a kingdom. Two people running a kingdom. The sentence landed in the space between them with the specific gravity of a structural revision, a fundamental alteration to the architecture of power that had governed Blackthorn Keep since its founding. Not a duke and his duchess, not a ruler and his political acquisition. Two people running a kingdom together, as a deliberate, mutual, operational choice rather than a contractual obligation. Kadric looked at her the way a man looks at a landscape that has changed so fundamentally during his absence that the familiar landmarks no longer serve as navigation points. Everything was different, not because the fortress had changed or the woman had changed, but because he had changed, broken open by 36 hours of sustained crisis into a configuration that no longer matched the design specifications he had been operating under for 9 years. He had marched through frozen mountains. He had stood in a valley and asked exhausted men to die with him rather than for him. He had fought 2 battles in 24 hours against forces that outnumbered his own. He had done all of it carrying the knowledge that the man he trusted most had been a weapon aimed at his back for 8 years. And through all of it, through every hour of cold and blood and pain and the systematic dismantling of every belief he had held about the relationship between power and isolation, the one constant had been the woman standing in front of him, not beside him, not behind him, ahead of him, seeing what he could not see, preparing for what he refused to prepare for, building the infrastructure of survival while he was busy performing the mythology of invincibility. "I owe you an apology," he said. Seraphina's expression shifted. Surprise. Genuine, unguarded surprise that crossed her face before her own control systems could intercept it. In 27 days, she had never heard those words from Kadric Blackthorn. No one in Ravenspire had. The Duke did not apologize. The Duke did not acknowledge debt. The Duke did not stand on the stairs of his own fortress with blood on his coat and an expression on his face that looked like a wall with the last brick removed. For what? For the conditions I imposed when you arrived, the restricted access, the surveillance, the assumption that you were a threat to be managed rather than a partner to be trusted. I treated you like every other person who has entered this fortress, as a potential weapon aimed at my survival, and you responded by saving my kingdom while I was bleeding in a valley 60 miles south. You were protecting yourself. I would have done the same. No, you would not have, and that is the point. He took a breath. The inhalation caught against his wound and produced a sound that was halfway between breathing and damage. You entered this fortress knowing you were a political transaction, knowing I would monitor you, restrict you, test you. You accepted those conditions and then systematically proved them unnecessary by being more competent and more trustworthy than every person I chose to trust before you arrived. You did not fight my walls. You made them irrelevant. Seraphina looked at him for a long time. The morning light had strengthened, catching the iron in her eyes and warming it to something closer to steel. The same material, heated to a different temperature, carrying a different kind of strength. "Come inside," she said. "You need a physician, and a bath, and approximately 40 hours of sleep. I need to deal with Hadrian first. Hadrian will be in the detention cell tomorrow, and the day after, and every day after that until you are ready. He is not going anywhere, Kadric. Neither am I." His name again, spoken without permission, without deference, without the elaborate social machinery that maintained distance between a duke and everyone else in the world. Just his name. Two syllables that sounded different when she said them. Heavier, warmer, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with title or authority, and everything to do with the simple, terrifying recognition that another human being saw him clearly and had decided to stay. He followed her inside. The confrontation with Hadrian took place 4 days later in the lower detention level of Blackthorn Keep. Not the formal interrogation chambers that were designed to intimidate through architecture. A small stone room with a table and 2 chairs and a single lantern that threw more shadow than light. Kedrick sat across from his former steward. The wound in his side had been stitched and dressed. His color had returned. The external damage was healing with the stubborn efficiency of a body that had been well built and consistently maintained despite its owner's determined efforts to destroy it through overwork and self-neglect. Hadrian looked older than he had 4 days ago. The composure that had been his defining characteristic for 26 years had collapsed inward, leaving a face that was readable for the first time. The deep lines around his eyes and mouth that mapped decades of sustained performance. The hollowed cheeks of a man who had not eaten properly in days. The hands resting on the table with a stillness that was no longer professional control, but the simple absence of any remaining reason to pretend. "Your son," Kedrick said. "His name." Hadrian's jaw tightened. "Matthias." "Age?" 14. "Location?" A vassal estate south of Meyercourt's capital, under the protection of a family named Aldane. They were paid to house him. They believe he is an orphan. Kedrick absorbed this. A 14-year-old boy living under a false identity in enemy territory, his existence used as leverage to turn a steward into a spy. The mathematics of that arrangement were familiar. The same transactional cruelty that governed every aristocratic interaction, the same reduction of human beings to instruments of political pressure. It was the system Kedrick had grown up inside, the system he had perpetuated. The system that had delivered Serafina to his fortress like cargo with a marriage contract. "I have sent a recovery team," Kedrick said. 12 men from Thorne's unit. They crossed the border 2 days ago under merchant cover. Meyercourt's military is in no condition to patrol effectively. The extraction should be completed within the week. Hadrian's composure broke completely. Not loudly, not dramatically. A fracture that spread across his features like ice cracking on a lake. The surface giving way to reveal the dark water beneath that had been there all along, held in place by a membrane of performance so thin that the wonder was not that it broke, but that it had held for 8 years. Moisture filled his eyes. His hands, resting on the table, began to tremble and did not stop. His breathing became audible. The ragged, uncontrolled respiration of a man whose body had decided to process 8 years of compressed terror in a single moment. "Why?" he whispered. "Because your son is 14 years old, because he did not choose his father's circumstances, and because punishing a child for the failures of the adults who were supposed to protect him is the kind of cruelty that I was raised to practice and have decided to stop perpetuating." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, saturated with the weight of a statement that represented not just a decision about one boy's fate, but a fundamental revision of the principles that had governed Kedrick Blackthorn's exercise of power for his entire adult life. He had been raised to believe that mercy was weakness, that compassion was a vulnerability enemies exploited, that the only safe response to betrayal was overwhelming, theatrical retribution designed to discourage future betrayals through the sheer spectacle of consequence. Standing in a valley full of dead men had taught him something different. Not that mercy was strength, that formulation was too simple, too clean, the kind of moral equation that existed in stories told to children who had never been forced to make actual decisions under actual pressure. What he had learned was more complicated and less comfortable. Mercy was expensive. It cost something real: political capital, perceived strength, the comfortable certainty that came from operating a system where every action had a predictable, proportional, violent response. But the alternative, the system of absolute retribution he had inherited and perfected, had produced a kingdom where his most trusted advisor had been working for the enemy for 8 years because the system left no space for a man to ask for help when his son's life was at stake. The system did not just punish betrayal. It created the conditions that made betrayal inevitable by eliminating every alternative. "You will not remain in Ravenspire," Kadric said. "When Matthias is recovered, you will both be relocated to the eastern provinces under new identities. You will have no contact with any member of the Blackthorn household or the Mirecourt network. You will live quietly. You will raise your son, and you will understand that this arrangement exists because one person in this castle argued that destroying you would only prove that the system that created your betrayal was functioning exactly as designed." "The Duchess," Hadrian said. "The Duchess." Hadrian closed his eyes. The tears that fell were silent, the overflow of a reservoir that had been filling for 8 years behind a dam made of professional composure and the sustained, grinding terror of a father who could not protect his child. "I am sorry," Hadrian said. "That word is insufficient. I know it is insufficient, but it is what I have." Kedrick stood, looked down at the man who had served his father, managed his household, maintained his fortress, and betrayed his kingdom simultaneously for 8 years. The living embodiment of the impossible contradictions that aristocratic power systems created by demanding absolute loyalty from people whose actual lives contained pressures and attachments that no system of absolute loyalty could accommodate. "I know," Kadric said. He left the room, closed the door, stood in the corridor outside the detention level with his back against the cold stone wall, and his eyes closed and his breathing slow and steady in the subterranean silence. A man discovered things about himself in moments like this, not the dramatic discoveries of battlefield revelations or political crises. The quiet discoveries, the ones that happened in empty corridors after difficult conversations, when the performance was over and the audience was gone, and the only observer was the version of yourself that existed beneath every layer of armor you had spent your life constructing. Kadric discovered that he was tired, not physically, though the wound still ached, and the exhaustion of the campaign still lived in his muscles and bones. Tired of the architecture, tired of the fortress he had built around himself and called strength, tired of the mythology of the ruthless Duke who needed nothing and no one and maintained control through the systematic elimination of every human vulnerability. The mythology had nearly destroyed him, would have destroyed him, if a woman with iron eyes and a talent for treasury analysis had not walked into his council chamber 27 days ago and started dismantling his walls by the simple method of being too competent to ignore and too honest to dismiss. He climbed the stairs from the detention level, walked through the corridors of Blackthorn Keep, his fortress, his inheritance, his cage that was slowly, painfully, being converted into something that might eventually resemble a home. He found Seraphina in the library. The treasury ledgers had been replaced by architectural plans for the southern settlements, reconstruction proposals for the villages that had sustained damage during the campaign. She had cross-referenced the rebuilding costs against the seized assets of the Mirecourt prisoners and the recovered funds from Ashwick's embezzlement network. The numbers balanced. The villages would be rebuilt using the wealth of the men who had tried to destroy them. She looked up when he entered, read his face the way she always read everything, quickly, accurately, without asking questions whose answers were already visible. "How is he?" she asked. "Broken, relieved, both at the same time. I did not know those could coexist until I watched it happen." "Most contradictions can coexist. That is what makes them contradictions rather than impossibilities." Kadric pulled a chair to the table, sat beside her rather than across from her, a positioning choice that would have been unthinkable 4 weeks ago, and now felt like the most natural geometry in the world. "The reconstruction estimates are ready," she said. "I need your approval on the labor allocation." "Approved? You have not read them." "I trust your numbers." Seraphina set down her pen, turned to face him. The candlelight softened the sharp angles of her features without diminishing the intelligence that lived behind her eyes, the same intelligence that had decoded a traitor's cipher, designed a counterintelligence operation, packed fire arrows for a battle that had not yet been planned, and kept a fortress functioning while its duke was bleeding in a mountain valley. "That is the first time you have said that word without it costing you something visible," she said. "It still costs. I have just decided the cost is worth paying." She studied him. The assessment was thorough and unhurried, the evaluation of someone deciding whether a structural change was genuine or performative. 27 days was not long enough to know a man completely, but it was long enough to know whether his architecture was shifting or whether he was simply rearranging the furniture inside the same walls. "I'm going to need a larger desk," she said. The statement was so unexpected, so deliberately mundane after the weight of everything that had preceded it, that Kaedric felt the unfamiliar muscular event occur on his face again. The softening around the eyes, the slight upward tension at the corners of his mouth that his body remembered from some previous version of himself that had existed before 9 years of solitary rule had frozen it into permanent neutrality. Not quite a smile, the architectural foundation of one. The first structural element of an expression that would take time to build and might never achieve the easy fluency that other men's faces produced without effort. But it was there, and she saw it. And she did not comment on it, which was the kindest thing she had ever done for him, allowing the change to exist without requiring it to perform. Outside the library windows, the sun was setting over Ravenspire. The light caught the black banners of House Blackthorn and turned them amber for a few minutes. A transient warmth that existed only at this precise angle, at this precise time, in this precise season. The kingdom had survived, not unchanged. Survival never left things unchanged. The borders would be redrawn, the alliances restructured. The political landscape of the northern provinces permanently altered by a campaign that had been won not through the mythology of the ruthless Duke, but through the combined intelligence of two people who had been forced together by transaction and had chosen to remain together through something harder to name and more durable than any contract. Kaedric sat in the library beside his wife and reviewed reconstruction plans for villages he had nearly lost, in a fortress that was slowly becoming something other than a monument to isolation, in a kingdom that was learning, as he was learning, that the most dangerous thing a powerful man could do was also the most necessary. Let someone in. The black banners of House Blackthorn continued to fly above the frozen cliffs. They would fly tomorrow, and the day after, and every day that followed for as long as the wind carried them, not because the man beneath them was ruthless enough to defend them alone, but because he had finally understood that alone was the one condition under which everything he defended would eventually fall.